this is also the opportunity for you to ask any questions or clarifications, because I guarantee you there's other individuals in here that there's other individuals here that probably have the same questions as you. I have a question, HM1. I was wondering if we could record this so the people who can watch can see this. I'm actually ahead of you. I'm recording it now, and then I'm going to upload it to YouTube once it is up and ready. So yes, it will be available for them. The only disadvantage for them is that they won't be able to ask questions. And for those of you that are here, you're going to be able to ask me questions. So hello for those of you that are using the chat. And for those of you that are using the phones, hopefully you can hear me loud and clear. If at any time you guys have any questions, to make it a lot easier, if you are using the chat function, just type in the questions because I can see that. If you're using the phone, feel free to unmute your mic and then ask the question, okay? Right. So before I begin, this is specifically for those that have access to your to the laptops. I had a lot of questions how to get to through the PowerPoints. So I'm just going to do a quick share screen for those of you. All right, 317448. I'm going to mute you. There's a lot of wind going through your phone, so you're going to be muted. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share screen my laptop right now so you guys can see where it is on Blackboard that you can get your PowerPoint. So let me log into that real quick, and I can show you where to access that. All right, share screen. All right, so I'm going to share. Hopefully you guys can see this screen right here. Each one is a little bit of a newbie. There we go. So you go to your Blackboard course, right? Courses, and then you look for our course number, class 200. It's going to load a little bit. And yes, you can access this through your phones, through your personal laptops without using your ID card. This screen right here, the one that's blackened a little bit, I don't know, it's been there for a while. They've been trying to repair it. But if you hover over your mouse on there's going to be links there. The link that you want to find is BMTC 103. So if you click that, different links are going to show up. So student materials, PowerPoint presentations, media. But the main thing, if you do want PowerPoint presentations, then they're going to be in this folder right here. The student materials will have all your basically practice quizzes, which I don't recommend because you already have MyBrady. I think MyBrady is a lot better than that one. And then you have the media, which has basically the audio review for each chapter. I listen to it personally. I like listening to it because it's a quick summary of each chapter. Okay, so that's how you get access to your Blackboard. All right, so stop the share screen and go back to that. All right, Johnson, go ahead and mute your microphone, please, because I can. There we go. Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. So this is going to be in chronological order. We're going to start from chapter 1 all the way up to chapter 8, right? I know we haven't covered chapter 8 yet, but hey, might as well talk about everything tonight. We'll take breaks as needed because I know you guys can only listen to my wonderful voice for so long. So we're going to go ahead and start with chapter 1. And yes, I can see your guys' ugly smirks on the camera, so watch out, okay? Right, so let's start with chapter 1. Okay, chapter 1 talks about the introduction to emergency medical care. This is a very short chapter that talks about, hey, what is EMT being about? A lot of critical concepts on here, but I'm just going to go ahead and point out the meats and potatoes. Warning, just because I did not cover it doesn't mean it's not going to be on the test. I'm all about the review sessions are supposed to be highlights, and it's not. I don't want you to think for a second, well, he didn't talk about that in the review, so it's not going to be in the test. That is an incorrect thinking. It's going to cause you to fail, okay? So let's talk about the EMS today, so the emergency medical system. So if you guys can see on page 4 of your textbook, right, the EMS today talks about several entities on there, the Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, where a lot of students get confused on what's the job of these two entities. Well, the Department of Transportation, if you look at it, remember your test comes from the book exactly. So if I'm looking at this one right here, it says the National Highway of Safety Act charged the Department of Transportation to develop EMS standards. So basically, DOT, what they did was they developed EMS standards. What does that mean? It basically says that if, let's say, for example, class 200, I wanted to create a class 200 EMS. I wanted to start an EMS company. Well, I have to follow the Department of Transportation guidelines in order for me to come up with an EMS agency. Okay. Well, what's the job of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration? Well, their job was to establish an assessment program with a set of standards for EMS system. Hey, please mute your microphones, please, because you guys are being heard. So please mute your mics. Okay. Right. So the NHTSA basically what they did was they established some checklists. If you think about it, NHTSA established some checklists of what consists of a good EMS agency. So if you look on page 4 all the way up through, actually just page 4, all those bold key points right there, those are what is needed for the standards of an EMS. You have to have regulation and policy, you have to have transportation, you have to have communication, a medical direction. So those are basically what I need in order for an EMS to be successful. Okay, is that clear with everybody? And you can just type in yes, you can do a thumbs up if you're using your webcam. Cool. Right, so let's move on. Now let's talk about the components of the EMS system. The best way to summarize this is on page 6. Those pictures right there, everything that you see on that picture is what consists of the EMS system. It starts with the patient or somebody who calls 911. The dispatcher is part of that. The one who says 911, how may I direct your call? They're part of that too. The EMTs who respond to that. The hospital emergency room that responds to it. The X-ray department that does the X-rays when they get to the hospital. All those consist of a big picture of the EMS system. Now, the question is, how do we access the EMS system? Well, everybody knows this already. You call 911. But 911 is just a simple telephone access. Since we are now in the 20th century, we have now what we call an enhanced 911, right? Enhanced 911 basically has the capability of detecting your phone number and location. And why is this important? Why is enhanced 911 such a great thing? Well, enhanced 911 is such a great thing because if the patient accidentally passed out and basically laid on the floor while they were talking to the dispatcher can simply activate geolocation and point out your exact location, address, and try to give you a call back if you got disconnected. So that's the beauty of the enhanced 911, right? Any questions with that? Like I said, I'm going to stop for every sections on here to make sure that everybody understands that. Right, let's move on. Let's talk about the levels of EMS training. There's 4 levels of EMS training, right? There's 4 levels. We're going to talk about the lowest level first, and then we're going to move on to the highest level. So we have the EMR, Emergency Medical Responder. Please know, don't just get used to acronyms. I don't want you to rely so much on acronyms because you'll get used to it and then you'll forget what EMR stands for. So emergency medical responders, they're the first on the scene. That's why they're the responders. When you respond to something, you're the first on the scene. However, the only thing they can do is basically first aid. That's all they can do is first aid and provide immediate life-threatening injuries. So when they get to the scene, somebody's bleeding out, they're trained to control that bleeding. That's all they can do. They cannot do anything else that the other 3 levels are trained to do. So EMR, emergency medical responder, first on scene. Second one is EMT. That's all of you. You are being trained on this level. As you can see, EMT used to be called EMT Basic. Why is that? Because 1, it's the minimum level certification that somebody needs to have in order to be in an ambulance. 2, all you learn is basic level of medical and trauma care. That's all you learn. You don't most of the treatments you'll find out in Mod 4 and Mod 5 are very basic, and they're all temporary treatments. That's the emergency medical technician that used to be called EMT basic. The third level of that one is Advanced Emergency Medical Technician, or AEMT. So what's so special about them? Well, they do what EMRs and EMTs do. However, they have advanced training, such as inserting an advanced airway device, those tubes that they stick down their throat, the ones that they can also do glucose monitoring. So basically, those are the ones that are able to prick a patient's finger. Okay, and they can also administer some medications via IV, the intravenous. They can give medications through that one or through the bone, intraosseous. So that's advanced emergency medical technician. And for those of you that are, well, for my future hospital corpsman, which is you, technically as hospital corpsman, you will be performing in the advanced EMT level. That's the main job of a corpsman. But the curriculum that we're teaching you right now is EMT, basic level and basic medical trauma. Okay, so that's advanced EMT. The last one is paramedic. Paramedic is basically the highest level of training that you can get. Everything that an EMT and that an AEMT does, that's what the paramedic do, plus advanced level of skills. H1, what advanced level of skills do they do? Well, certain paramedics are given more responsibilities of being able to administer drugs and being able to perform procedures that AEMT and EMT cannot do. For example, some paramedics, and this is not everybody, some paramedics are able to do cricoid thyroidomy, basically cut their cricoid cartilage, which we talked about in class, and then insert a tube down there. So that's what some paramedics are able to do, and it's the highest level of training. So going back, level EMR first on scene, EMT basic level medical and trauma, advanced EMT. You can do advanced airway devices, glucose levels, and some medications. And paramedic is everything that the EMT and the AEMT does. Okay, everybody understands that? Everybody good? Cool. Right. So, what are the roles and responsibilities? I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna go over this in detail. Basically, roles and responsibilities. If you were, well, Mr. Andy didn't teach this class, but Mr. Andy, I like his teaching to summarizing this specific paragraph on page 8. Roles and responsibilities of the EMT: don't be an asshole. That's what basically it means. Don't be an asshole to your patients, or else you'll get in trouble. Same thing with becoming a hospital corpsman. So, if you're not a people person and you thought hospital corpsman is the perfect job for you, or being a med tech is the perfect job for you, you're wrong. Okay, you're supposed to put a smile on your face and treat everybody happily and with the best and utmost care. Welcome. Right. Any questions? Same thing with that page 9 right there. Traits of a good EMT, physical traits and personal traits. Those are all self-explanatory, so I'm not going to waste my time on reading all those to you. However, there's one thing over there that says, as a physical trait for an EMT, you should be able to lift at least up to 125 pounds, right? That's the minimum. Right, moving on. So for education of an EMT, you need to be always educated, not just by attending an EMT course, but also basically refreshing yourselves, attending refresher courses. An example of this that I always tell my students, you have all these apps on your phone, but what apps? Strozier, yeah, there we go. Mute your phone, thank you. So for those of you that have cell phones, you have multiple apps, but what apps do you have that will basically advance your medical knowledge on certain things? You are about to be a future hospital corpsman and med techs. The least you can do is have apps that are related to that. And two of my favorite ones is Medscape and MedJournal. Those are like apps that anything that I have question with, I can just open those apps and I can type in the disease or something and it will load it up for me and it will break it down to me in very simple layman's terms. So Medscape, MedJournal, it's not in your book, but it's just an FYI. I always tell my corpsmen, hey, how about you have something like that? So once you're updated with all these news in the medical field, right? So that's an example of how we can improve ourselves as EMT, reading medical magazines, journals, watching videos that are related to medical. That's how you're going to improve. It's not just attending. Don't think that after 14 weeks you're a subject matter expert already. It's a continuous thing. Like myself, I always still strive to continuously learn. Okay. Moving on, page 11, where will you become a provider? Everywhere. To summarize that paragraph, you're going to become a provider everywhere. Public places, sports events, the beach, um, assisting in vaccinations. Those are places where you're going to become a provider. Okay. Moving on. Any questions so far? Everybody good so far? Good, good, good. Perfect. And let me know if I'm just if I'm talking too fast or if you missed something. Please feel free to unmute your mic and let me know as well. Okay. Great. Moving on to quality improvement. Quality improvement is basically how are we going to identify? It's basically identifying how can we better ourselves and the EMS system that we currently have. How do you do that? Well, you review certain things. Let me use an example. If you're an EMT and you get a call, and your calls it's taking you 45 minutes from the time that you leave the station all the way up to the patient and transport your patient. And that's quite long for somebody who is an emergency medical technician. So the medical direction might say, hey, you know what? We might want to train you in reducing your time from 45 minutes to 30 minutes. And let's see what we can do about that. So that's an example of a quality improvement. It's a process of continuous self-review with the purpose of identifying and correcting aspects that require improvement. Okay? Right. So part of the quality improvement as well is ensuring that you have your medical director. So on page 13, it has those several things that are important for you to know, because the medical director is something that you will hear about starting Mod 2 and onwards. The medical director or the medical direction has a very important job. A medical director is basically a physician. That's their main job. Medical direction is what they provide to the EMS. So everybody who is running that ambulance works under a medical director. He is the ultimate responsible person for whatever happens on the scene. The medical direction is divided into two. We have online and offline medical direction. Online medical direction, basically you do it by the radio or over the phone. Offline medical direction, it's basically listed already. You don't have to call the medical direction. For example, when you take on the job, it says in your contract, hey, when you see a patient that's passed out, you do CPR. Those are basically examples of offline medical directions, okay? So what's the difference between protocols and standing orders? Well, if you look at it, they're almost similar, okay? So protocols, if you look at the definition in your textbook, it's a list of steps, such as assessments to be taken in different situations. So, for example, here in San Antonio, we might approach, for example, the EMS might be allowed to do CPR even when they're off duty. But when you go to Austin, the protocol is, no, you have to be on duty in order to provide CPR for a patient. I'm just giving an example. So those are examples of protocols. It's a list of assessments and steps to be taken in a given situation. So protocols can differ from each state and even in each city alone. And I can tell you, Austin and San Antonio have very diverse protocols when it comes to their EMS agencies, okay? A standing order is a policy or a protocol that authorizes EMTs to perform particular skills. So an example of this is a standing order can be something that says, when a patient looks like they're experiencing shock, you need to transport them right away. That's a standing order. Okay, so, and it kind of ties into an offline medical direction. So a standing order is all I need in order to treat my patient for shock. So those are examples. That's the main difference of protocols and standing orders. Is that clear, everybody? Okay, good to go. right? So make sure you understand, not just memorize the definition of those, but actually try to put that's why I like giving examples, because it helps clarify a lot of things that are not too clear or similar, okay? Moving on, EMS role into public health, page 14. So your book gave you 4 examples. You are injury prevention for geriatric patients and for youth. Okay, so when you go to a household, you see an old man and he doesn't have a handrail by the bathtub. As an EMT, you can technically suggest, sir, hey, so that you don't slip again, you might want to invest on a handrail there, and that's something that you can do. You can also assist in public vaccinations and disease surveillance. So an example of disease surveillance is you can, and within Fort Sam Houston, an example of the disease surveillance that we get is that there's a lot of shortness of breath cases and a lot of musculoskeletal injuries. Basically, a lot of people spraining their ankle, stress fractures, and a lot of people passing out. So those are some things that the EMS agencies report, so that they can identify the trends for that specific area. Because if I'm able to identify, for example, in Fort Sam Houston, in our base, if I know that the most common things that my EMTs are going to respond to are people passing out and people breaking their bones, then I'm probably going to up my training on them to, hey, this is how we can efficiently fix these bones and provide proper care for those that are having a hard time breathing. So that's why that disease surveillance is important there, okay? Right, any questions with that? All right, so that research right there, starting from page 15, 17, 18, 19, those are, you can read that on your own. I'm going to be honest with you. They just added this recently for the 13th edition, and it's so advanced that you can read it on your own. I'm not going to cover that here. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. Right, so that is basically for chapter 1. Is that clear for everyone? Right. We're now going to move on to chapter 2, right? Chapter 2, well-being of the EMT. Right, so the well-being of an EMT just talks about 2 separate things. 1, it talks about how do you protect yourself as an EMT, and 2, it talks about stress. Because as EMTs or as human beings, we're prone to getting stressed, right? So let's talk about the well-being first. Well-being is basically your overall health, including your physical, mental, well-being, right? It's not just like physically, it's also mentally as well. Okay, so we have a couple of key terms in here, such as pathogens. Pathogens are anything that can cause infection. So bacteria, virus. So you don't wash your hands. After you go to the bathroom, you're passing pathogens to somebody. You sneeze on somebody, you're passing pathogens. Okay, so those are the ones that can cause infection. Standard precaution is basically the assumption that everything is infectious, including all bodily fluids. Because if you have that standard precaution, you're going to be thinking, oh my gosh, that blood that I see there, he can possibly have HIV, or he can probably have a virus that I might get. If you think that way, then you're always going to be extra cautious, which is what we want. You don't want to assume that everything, oh, it's okay. She's rich anyway. She lives in Beverly Hills, California. She doesn't have a disease. I don't have to wear gloves. That's probably like the most idiotic thing that you can do as an EMT. So standard precautions is assuming that everything, all bodily fluids and blood, is it's infectious. Okay, so everybody clear in those 2 terms. Right. Let's move on. PPE. Personal protective equipment. You're going to hear this all the time. PPE, 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 PPE. Personal protective equipment, not personal protection, not personal protected, personal protective equipment is anything that protects you from any infectious pathogens, right? So there's several examples of PPE. Okay, and these are all issued by OSHA. OSHA stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Every time there's every job in the United States that has a risk with safety, OSHA has guidelines for that. Well, guess what? As EMTs, our safety is at risk. So OSHA implements these guidelines so that we don't get exposed to those pathogens. So there's different PPEs. Let's talk about them. The first PPE that we have are protective gloves, right? So we have different types of gloves. We have most of the gloves that we do have now are non-latex gloves, because you'll find out around mod 4 that the gloves, if they have latex in them, some majority of the people are allergic to latex. So that we're switching now to the non-latex gloves, and it prevents us from basically contaminating pathogens from blood and bodily fluids of our patient. Okay. Then we also have hand cleaning. You can wash your hands, which is the preferred method, but we can also use hand sanitizer if your hand is not soiled in blood or dirt. So basically, if you can see like black marks or dried blood on your hands and you just sanitize it, you're just basically spreading that pathogen. You want to make sure that you wash your hands. Alcohol-based hand cleaners are only for those things that are those things in your hands that are not visibly soiled. Okay. We also have eye and face protection. Why do we need eye and face protection? Well, your eyes, they have mucous membranes in them. What do I mean by that? There's openings in your eyes that when fluids get into it, you can also get what infection that they have. So you want to make sure that you protect your eyes at all times, as well as your face, because you do have pores on your face. Okay. Then we also have masks. For masks, there's two things here that I want you to know, because you're also going to know this. You need to know this for mod 2s and onwards. Okay, N95 and HEPA mask, or HEPA, whatever you want to call it. It's N95 and HEPA mask. HEPA stands for high efficiency particulate air. The N95 or the HEPA mask is specifically made because for patients with possible tuberculosis. Okay, you cannot tell. But just by looking at a patient that, oh, she has tuberculosis or a little cough, tuberculosis. But if you do know for a fact, or if there are evident signs and symptoms of tuberculosis, you might want to put on a N95 or HEPA mask in order for you not to get that pathogens from the tuberculosis. Okay. Then we have gowns. Gowns is specifically there. It's not the gowns that you wear for prom, but basically hospital gowns or surgical gowns. So these gowns are going to be needed because in mod 6, you're going to learn how to deliver a baby. And I don't know how many of you have seen or assisted or have seen live birth. There's a lot of things, a lot of fluids that come out that you don't expect coming out and exploding from the mother. Right, so you want to make sure that you do have gowns, and mod 6 will make sure that you guys see that as well, right? So those are your examples of your PPE. So any questions with that class? Pretty straightforward, right? So standard precautions, pathogens, PPE, OSHA, N95. Next, let's move on. Diseases of concern. There's only several diseases of concerns that your book mentioned to you, okay? So you have hepatitis. It's an inflammation of the liver. Okay, there's hepatitis A, B, and C. Hepatitis A and hepatitis B, we have vaccines for. Hepatitis C, we don't have vaccines for it, so it's still considered a very dangerous one. And hepatitis B used to kill a lot of healthcare workers. That's why today, if you want to work in a hospital, you need to have at least hepatitis B vaccine, or else they're not going to take you in. This is why you at boot camp receive this, hepatitis A and B. Okay. And then we have tuberculosis. It's basically an infection that settles in the lung, and it's highly contagious. Okay, it's highly contagious. You know why? Because all it takes is for somebody to cough and you inhale those droplets that came out of their mouth or their nose, and you inhale that, and you can potentially increase your chances of getting tuberculosis. Okay. And then you have AIDS. AIDS is basically acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So people think that, oh my gosh, I touch blood, I'm going to get AIDS. Now that you're medical professionals, that's not the way to think anymore. It starts with HIV first, human immunodeficiency virus. HIV is basically a disease that attacks your immune system. It's not and it causes you to it's a virus that causes you to have a weak immune system. With that being said, you are prone to getting different kinds of diseases, right? Because if your immune system is weak, a little bit of sneeze, a little bit of fever can potentially kill you. Well, when HIV is not treated, it can blow up to AIDS. That's what basically That's what AIDS is. So don't think that you can automatically get AIDS because they have it. It's not that way. It starts with HIV and then blows up to AIDS. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Good to go. I am hearing some microphones that are not mute. Please mute your mics if you just logged into the class. Okay. Right. Next, so there's emerging diseases and conditions listed on there. I'm not going to go over that too much. The MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, the bird flu, also known as the avian flu. I'm pretty sure you guys were born during that time already where everybody was freaking out and nobody wanted to go to the zoo because they thought all birds were infected, right? There was also the swine flu, and for that time, nobody wanted to eat pork because they thought they were going to get like swine flu as well. So those were some emerging diseases and conditions that came out over the past 10 years or so. Okay, but let's move on to infection control and the law. So infection control and the law, there's two agencies that are mainly responsible for infection control. So these two agencies are OSHA and CDC. Okay, the two agencies, OSHA and CDC. As I mentioned earlier, OSHA is basically responsible for everybody who has a job or everybody in a job that has a safety risk. That's OSHA. CDC is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. That's the main job of the CDC. So they created guidelines of how to basically ensure that you don't get exposed to any type of infection. This is why hospitals, once you guys start working in hospitals, we have very strict guidelines of what to do when we're dealing with patients, when you're drawing blood, when you're cleaning up blood. It's very strict guidelines because that is what the CDC and the OSHA has put in place. I'm not sure if you guys were in boot camp. I'm pretty sure. No, you probably weren't in boot camp. But when what's that? Ebola. When there was an Ebola breakout here, and then it reached in Dallas, Texas, the CDC and OSHA acted right away to basically implement some standards on how to make sure that they don't pass on that the nurses and the doctors don't catch the Ebola virus. So that's their main job. Okay. Right, and on page 36 and 37, those are basically the guidelines that OSHA and CDC came up with. You have to have an infection exposure control plan. If you look at their hepatitis B vaccination is mandatory because, like I said, every healthcare worker needs to have that. Labeling anything that is considered infectious in the hospital. Once you guys report to your hospitals, you're going to be oriented and all types of labels, like this is the labels for blood, this is the labels for x-rays, etc., etc. Okay. Any questions so far? All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the Ryan White Care Act, right? So the Ryan White Care Act is basically a law to help healthcare workers who think that they were potentially exposed to tuberculosis, HIV, or hepatitis, right? I am hearing somebody who's not muted. There you go. Mute your microphones, please. Thank you. Right, so if you look on page 38, this is what the Ryan White Care Act allows you to do. As an EMT, you can't just say, hey, I want to look at the patient's record if they have HIV. Hey, let me see the patient's record if they have hepatitis. That is all sorts of violation to their privacy. However, you can go to your designated officer who will follow the protocols in order to find out if the patient does have hepatitis or HIV or tuberculosis. Does that make sense, class? Right, so I don't want you guys to think that as EMTs, you can just directly do that. Right, moving on. Let's talk about the immunizations. There's only one immunization or one test here that was mentioned on your book on page 40. Immunizations, it talked about the TST, tuberculin skin test. Tuberculin skin test is a test to make sure that if you were exposed to possible high-risk areas where there is tuberculosis, you do the tuberculin skin test. And that's basically when they inject something on your forearm and they wait, if a bump shows up, then you're probably a tuberculosis carrier or you have tuberculosis, okay? And this is common for those that are, if you come back from deployment or any areas like that, okay? So TST, tuberculin skin test. It's a test to ensure that if you were exposed to or if you're a carrier of tuberculosis. Right now, there's no immunizations for tuberculosis. There's no way to be immunized against it. Unlike hepatitis A and B, we do have immunizations for that, okay? So that's the well-being part of this chapter. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns? And if you do, please feel free to ask on the chat box or unmute your mics if you're using the phones. Everybody good? Everybody good? All right, let's move on. Emotions and stress, right? Stress is not bad, okay? Stress is not bad. You have good stress, you have bad stress. Good stress is called eustress, right? EU, then the word stress. Bad stress is de-stress. Those are the two types of stress. Stress is anything that causes you to have a psychological arousal, physical or psychological arousal to a stimulus. So when you are dozing off in class and HM1 Abreu like suddenly yells at you and you kind of like, oh shit, okay, that's an example of a psychological and a physical arousal, okay? Or if at a given, if you're like that, you know, constant sleeper in class and I start throwing, you know, stuff in your face, because I will, then that's a physical arousal as well, right? Shelby with the Oreos. What? Oh, you have Oreos. I hate you. Next, let's talk about the different stages of stress, right? There's 3 stages of stress, okay? There's alarm reaction, stage of resistance, and exhaustion. Okay, 3 stages of stress: alarm reaction, stage of resistance, and exhaustion. So let's talk about the first stage first. Alarm reaction is when basically when everything goes up, your heart rate goes up, your eyes like pop out and they open wide, right? And then you're breathing really fast. That is the alarm reaction. Since we already talked about chapter 6, what part of the nervous system is responsible for activating your alarm reaction? And you can type it in the chat box, you can yell it out. What part of the nervous system is responsible mainly for the alarm reaction? What is it? What part is that? Very good. Sympathetic. That is exactly correct. Sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the alarm reaction. Okay. Then moving on is the stage of resistance. This is when you've adapted and it no longer stresses you out. For example, during your time frame, when you're trying to train for something, let's use marathon, okay, or running. Your very first day that you're trying to train for that run, you probably feel like you're about to die. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die. I'm not gonna survive this. But every day that you're exposing yourself to that stressor, you get used to it. So that's basically the stage of resistance. Your body doesn't feel like it's already stressed because it has gotten used to it already, okay? And there's also a, what do you call this? There's also a hormone or a chemical that your body produces when you are stressed, and that is called cortisol. Right? So cortisol is basically a chemical that you can detect in the blood. This is why sometimes doctors, when they draw your blood and they cannot find any reason of why you are feeling this way, and they determine that there's high levels of cortisol in your blood, that's when they say, oh, you're extremely fatigued, you're really stressed, you need to probably like just relax and take off for a couple of days. That's because of cortisol right there, okay? And then the last stage, we have the stage of exhaustion. This one is, not a lot of people get to this stage, thankfully. But when they do, it's very dangerous because there's 3 things that happen in the stage of exhaustion: hypertrophy, atrophy, and gastric ulcers. Hypertrophy is basically when your adrenal glands enlarge. Well, HM1, so what if the adrenal glands enlarge? Well, that is very dangerous because that means your body's always going to produce adrenaline. And you cannot be producing adrenaline 24/7. That's going to be dangerous because your body's always going to be in stress mode. That's going to cause you to break down. So that's what hypertrophy is. Atrophy is wasting away of the lymph nodes. Why is that dangerous? Because the lymph nodes, as we talked about, maintains body fluid and also protects you from infection. So when that is wasting away, you're losing your backup for your immune system. And last but not the least, bleeding gastric ulcers. I need not to explain why that is dangerous. Again, exhaustion, not a lot get to it, but when they do, three things happen: hypertrophy, atrophy, and gastric ulcer bleedings. Does that make sense, class? Very good. Then we have the types of stress reactions. Okay, so those what we talked about, those are stages, right? Stages of stress reaction. Now these are the types of stress reactions. We have the acute. Acute basically means it happened right away. So and it usually happens within a couple of days to a couple of weeks. So for example, when your partner when your EMT partner dies, right? Or when you see a child, when you respond to a call and it was a dead child or an abused child, you basically have that, you have that, the way that you react to it, that's called an acute stress reaction because you responded to it right away, right? That's why it's called an acute stress reaction. Then you have delayed stress reaction. Delayed stress reaction, typically it's days, months, sometimes even years. An example of this is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And which population is very exposed to PTSD? Who's exposed to that? Us, right? The military personnel, especially those that are exposed to combat zone. But post-traumatic stress disorder can happen not even just in the combat zone. And for those that got into a bad car accident, some of them still have that, when they have that fear of getting into a car, they get like so nervous. That's an example of PTSD, but it's a delayed stress reaction, right? So acute happens right away, delayed, a couple months, probably up to a year. Cumulative, okay, cumulative, hold on. HM1, can you turn on your vid? Why you gotta see my face? I'll think about it. My face is greasy. Okay. Face is greasy. Later. Okay. Oh, my voice ain't enough, huh? You guys, I'm pretty sure you listen to the radio. I have a radio host talk show voice. That's what I tell myself. Anyway, cumulative stress reaction. These are the people you need to watch out for. Okay. So, you know those people who are like, who've experienced so much and then they still act like everything's okay. It's like, hey, are you okay? It's like, no, I'm fine. You know, let's move on with life. So these are people that bottle up everything. And I see some of y'all in the webcam nodding and like, oh, yep, that's me right there. So these are like, for example, your roommate, right? All of a sudden they just like, why did you move my fucking toothbrush here? It's like, whoa, dude, calm down. Like, I'm sorry, it moved a little bit. But it's not the toothbrush, you moving the toothbrush that caused them to be stressed. It's all the stressors, and you moving that toothbrush basically was the trigger to that. That's because it's cumulative stress reaction, right? So this is why I always tell you, I always tell my class and even my junior sailors, when you're stressed, you need to find a healthy outlet for it. Okay, especially here in BMTCP in San Antonio, you need to find a healthy outlet. And Shelby, it's not the Oreo cookies that you're munching on like a fatness every day. Okay. Right. So that's basically for those three types of stress reaction, right? So we have acute, delayed, and cumulative stress. Okay. Let's move on. Any questions for those, class? Right, let's move on. Causes of stress. This is just some of the things that can cause you stress as an EMT, but we all know there's more to this. Multiple casualty incident. This is basically when there's more than one patient involved. Yes, that is stressful, and yes, you will experience it. Calls involving infants and children. I personally am not a big fan of calls involving infants and children. Not because, and I know Bravo, you know this, not because I don't particularly like children and infants, but because it's when children and infants are involved, especially the calls where it's abused infants, abused children, it does kind of hit you in some manner. So that's why it causes stress for a lot of EMTs. Okay, severe injuries. For example, if you've never seen blood or if you've never seen an amputated leg or amputated foot, that can cause stress as well. Abuse and neglect, just like I mentioned, and the death of a coworker. That can also cause some stress for an EMT, okay? So how do we deal with stress? Well, dealing with stress, some people know how to properly deal with stress. Some people run, some people change their eating habits. So those are the positive ways of doing it. Some people relax and take a time off. Here in BMT, here in the schoolhouse, you obviously are limited of what you can do to relieve stress, because especially if you're hashtag phase one, you can't do shit, right? So that's you're so limited, or ITP for my Air Force counterparts, right? You're limited to what you can do. However, you need to find a healthy outlet, like I said, or else it's gonna catch on to you. Especially when I usually see it in weeks 5 and 6. That's when the stressors are really, really high. Okay, so another way that EMTs deal with stress is we have what we call CISM, the CISMs, right? You're gonna hear this as the CISMs. CISM stands for Critical Incident Stress Management. This is basically a way where the EMS provides you with education and resources to prevent stress and how to deal with stress. So, for example, if you respond to a call and it was your patient died, right? Of course, that's going to be stressful. Your company is not just going to say, "Oh, hey, are you okay? Yeah, I'm good. Okay, good. Go ahead and your report tomorrow, same time." No, they're not going to do that. They're going to have you talk and sit down with a counselor. They're going to ask you to express your feelings and all that, because they want to make sure that you know how to properly respond to that. So that's called a CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management. Okay. Another way to respond to stress is called DABDA. Okay, so for those of you that don't know that acronym, that's basically a reaction that people respond to when they're stressed, or specifically when they respond to death and dying. When somebody is about to die, or when somebody died, people go through these stages: DABDA, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, right? So let me go through this one by one. It's actually my favorite one out of all of this. So I'm pretty sure everybody can relate to this at one point, okay? Except if you're hashtag forever alone. Breakups, right? So breakups. All of us went through breakups at one point in our life, or majority of us. I'm not going to say all of us, okay? So first, when there is a breakup, for example, okay? Denial. It's like, oh no, you're not breaking up with me today. Not today, right? Not during Christmas in front of my parents. Are you out of your fucking mind? Okay. Then anger kicks in. You know what? You're a piece of shit anyway, right? I don't want you in my life. Anger kicks in. And then a couple days later, bargaining. Babe, please pick up the phone. Okay, I've been calling you for the past 45 minutes. I left you like 800 voicemails already. Pick up the phone. I promise I'm not going to look at your Facebook account without letting you know. Okay, bargaining. And then depression kicks in, right? Depression. You're all sad, right? You're all sad. You're eating your Chunky Monkey Ben and Jerry's ice cream. You're watching reruns of Friends. That's depression. Then finally, you have acceptance, right? You know what? I don't need you, right? Hashtag girls night out. Hashtag I'm going to go out with my peeps. I moved on, right? So DABDA. Now it's kind of like a lighter side of DABDA, but denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, everybody goes through it. However, it doesn't always have to be in order. Like, just like there's like a meme going around, like when girls break up and when guys break up, right? It's kind of like the opposite. It's kind of the same thing for DABDA. Some people start with acceptance, and then a couple days later they're in denial, and then depression, right? So DABDA. Okay, everybody clear with that one? Cool. Right. Now let's talk about scene safety. Right. So this is the last part of this topic right here. So scene safety is very important. It's the safety of the EMS personnel is what is paramount. So it's your safety, and then your partner's safety, and then your patient safety, right? Because we're selfish like that. Because if you're not going to consider your safety, then how are you going to be able to save your patient? You're just going to be another casualty. So make sure that the scene is safe first before you jump into it. So when it comes to, it gave you four different scenarios. So first one, if there's a hazardous material incident, that basically means chemicals, unknown fluids are on the scene. What do you do? Well, first off, you're not going to dip your finger in that unknown liquid and taste it and put it in your tongue and say, yep, definitely gasoline. Yeah, let's evacuate the scene. No, that's not how you do it. The book suggests look up your emergency response guidebook and try to, based on what you hear, see, and smell, you're going to identify what that hazardous material is. Okay. And then when it comes to terrorist incidents, we have a full-blown chapter. It's actually our last chapter in textbook for Mod 7 on how to respond to terrorist incidents. Because just like what happened to 9/11, you will be responding to that one as EMTs. It can happen. Okay. And then rescue operations. Rescue operations are basically as an EMTs. For example, if somebody's stuck in a, doing hiking, and they're in the middle of nowhere, you might be responding to that call, and you might have to utilize special rescue operations equipment. Okay. And then you have violence. Violence is very, very common, as surprisingly, for EMTs, like domestic violence or a fight in the bar, etc. 911 gets called, and EMTs will always be responding over there. So in order to do that, you have to make sure that you plan accordingly. First off, what do we need to have? What type of PPE do we need to have? You want to observe everything else too. So if are there broken glasses? Or is there drugs involved? Is there alcohol involved? Is there a weapon involved? Okay, and then you're going to react. Okay, so there's several ways that you can react to danger. There's actually an acronym that you're going to use. So if the scene is not safe, from here on out, I want you guys to remember the 3 R's. Okay, so if you ask, is the scene safe? If we say the scene is not safe, you just need to respond, okay, I'm going to go ahead and retreat, radio, reevaluate. Okay, so if the scene is not safe because it's in danger, you're going to retreat, radio, and reevaluate. Those are the 3 R's. Does that make sense, class? Right? So again, if the scene is dangerous, respond using the 3 R's. I'm going to retreat. That means I need to go away, go into cover, radio, call for backup, and then reevaluate if everything else is good to go. Okay? Everybody clear with that? That's the last of chapter 2. Good to go, right? Any questions so far? Hashtag blah, 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 blah. All right, let's go ahead and take 5 minutes. No, you're not going to get 10 minutes. This is not class. You get 5 minutes. You're already at home. Fine, take 5 since I need to take a water break anyway. And yes, let me wipe off my greasy face so I can turn on the cam for those of you visual learners. Jesus, so needy. Needy, needy, needy. All right, 5 minutes, folks. Drink water, eat Oreos, be fat. Shelby. All right, party people, you guys ready? Cool beans. All right. All right, so let's pick up with chapter 3. All right, lifting and moving patients. So lifting and moving patients, part of in tying into the scene safety is also part of safety for your patients. You have to learn how to properly lift your patients. They're not just a piece of meat like, pork that just got out of the, meat section that you just drag on the floor, right? They're not those type of meat, okay? So we have to properly lift our patients without further injuring them or causing any more injuries, okay? So this is why we have what we call body mechanics. Body mechanics simply means using your body correctly so that when you're lifting, so that you don't injure yourself, okay, and your patient. So when you are doing that, the book gives you several tips. I'm not going to go over that individually on page 54 and page 55, right? So when you are lifting, there are several rules. Position your feet properly, use your legs, okay? And another thing too, when you are using your, when you are reaching for something, keep your back in a lock position, avoid twisting, and avoid prolonged reach. So those are some things that the book gave you tips on. The book also talked about different types of techniques, power lift and power grip. Okay, power lift basically means you're lifting from a squatting position. Okay, when you're lifting from a squat, HM1, I'm a bit fine. Jesus, Williams, you needy. Where's Williams? I don't even know what Williams looks like. Okay, there you go, Williams. Chapter 4. I'm gonna open my cam in chapter 4. My face still greasy. Okay. All right, so power lift and power grip. So power lift is basically when you use your when you're using, for those of you that go to gym, right? When you lift weights, they always tell you, hey man, don't lift with your back, lift with your legs, whatever. That's actually true. Okay, you have to lift. You're using more of your legs and you're squatting to grab from the ground. Power grip is basically using as much hand surface as you can. Okay, so that's the power grip, so that you don't accidentally slip on your patient. Because trust me, unlike grocery bags where you can put them on your fingers and you're like, oh hell no, I'm not going to make 2 trips. So take all 18 grocery bags and some of them are laying on your fingertips. Well, your patients are not like that. You can't put like, you know what, I'm just going to have some of the stretcher on 3 of my fingertips, because that's good. They're going to slip. Then they're going to die, and then you're going to get in trouble, and then you're going to go to prison, then you're going to die. So a lot of things can happen, right? I know it's kind of dramatic, but still. Right, so now let's talk about pushing and pulling. Which is better, pulling or pushing? Push, there we go. Thank you. Thanks, Duplessis. Even on this one, you're so loud and annoying. I mean, motivated. Okay, so let's talk about protecting your patients, okay? How do we protect our patients when it comes to moves? There's 3 types of moves, and a lot of students get confused on this one, so I want to kind of take my time on this. When it comes to moves, the first one is you have your emergency move. Emergency move is, it's time sensitive. I need to get my patient out of there quick, but I don't care about their spine, okay? So that means, hey, buildings are exploding, there's gas leaking, those like Hollywood effects that they have, like, oh my gosh, we need to get out of here. Emergency moves, right? Urgent moves, it's almost the same concept. It's time sensitive. However, I care about my patient's spine, because if I don't, their spine's already somewhat damaged, I need to protect it. So that's basically the urgent moves right there, okay? So emergency move, I have to move my patient right away, but I kind of don't care about the spine right now. Urgent moves, I also don't have time, but I need to protect the spine. The non-urgent moves, and that's very self-explanatory. Non-urgent moves basically means you have time and there's no spinal injury, okay? And the spine is very important because, as we learned in chapter 6, the spine has a lot of nerve endings, right? The spine has a lot of nerve endings that if it's damaged, remember we talked about 33 spinal bones? If any of those are damaged, it can cause paralysis, it can cause your patient to not breathe. So that's why that's why the spine is so important as an EMT, Okay, so those are the three types of move: emergency, urgent, and non-urgent. Is everybody clear on that? And I'm not going to go over each of those liftings right there. I just want you to know those specific types. Okay, what would be an what would be an example of an urgent case? Okay, so let me give you an example of an urgent case. For example, your patient got into a car accident, right? And then it's time for them to, you have to get them out of the car, okay? You have to get them out of the car, but it was a front end collision, okay? So that means that it was a really, really bad wreck. Well, you're not just gonna remove your patient out of there because their spine might have been damaged already. So I still want to somewhat protect my patient's spine by putting them in a long spine board. That's why in your page 57, it says right there, moving a patient onto a long spine board is an urgent move when there's immediate life threat and a suspicion of spine injury. Does that make sense? Lafon? Yes, no, cool, right. Awesome. Right, so let's move on to the different types of carrying devices, right? Your page 62, there's like different pictures of the carrying devices. So it talked about wheeled stretchers, right? So most stretchers right now, some of them have some of them are manual, some of them are automatic, right? So the automatic wheeled stretchers are actually more common now because that you don't have to manually lift it. All you got to do is press on a pedal and then it lifts and then goes down, right? Another example of a stretcher is a bariatric stretcher. A bariatric stretcher is for those patients that are significantly overweight or obese, right? So yes, just like Shelby, exactly, because of the Oreos that he's been eating. Correct. I'm kidding. Nobody said that, Shelby. I just made that up. Okay. So that's for your bariatric stretcher. So a lot of students ask as well, HM1, why can't we just have bariatric stretchers so that we don't have to wait for them? Well, a bariatric stretcher is pretty big, right? And it takes a lot of space in an ambulance. So that's why we don't have a lot of bariatric stretchers and we only put it in certain ambulances, okay? Other examples of the stretchers or patient carrying devices is a stair chair. Stair chair is preferred if you're going down by the word itself, if you're going down through the stairs, right? Because the elevators are not always going to be working. And if your patient doesn't have spine injury and they can sit on a chair, then you put them on a stair chair, okay? And your book on page 66 has an example of what a stair chair looks like, okay? And then you have the spine board. You're going to learn how to put each other on a spine board, yes? Around mod 5, right? That's the head and neck spine lab. You're going to strap each other down on a spine board so you can experience how to put a real patient on there, okay? And then you also have a scoop stretcher. Scoop stretcher is basically for patients that have the scoop stretcher is just patients that have pelvic injury. So when they break their hips, you scoop them off the ground and then put them on a stretcher or on a long spine board, right? Then we also have a basket stretcher, also known as the Stokes stretcher. This is for those that are in a rough terrain. So when you don't have a flat path or when you have to go up and down, that's the basket stretcher for you. And then flexible stretcher or Reeve stretcher. This is more useful when when you need to go through narrow hallways because the stretcher is flexible, okay? And then you have the vacuum mattress. I personally don't like the vacuum mattress. I've used it once. It's hard to assemble. Well, easy to assemble, but you have to keep ensuring that the air doesn't come out of the vacuum mattress. So those are examples of the patient carrying devices. Okay. Right. Any questions with those, class? Right. Yes. What's the question, Meza? Unmute your mics because you're muted still.
Is it the rib stretcher, HM1, or?
What? I'm sorry, what is it?
Another term for the flexible stretcher?
Yeah, flexible stretcher is also known as the Reeves stretcher, yes.
As Reeve? Okay. Thank you, HM1.
Yep. All right. So moving on, page 69, moving patients onto carrying devices. So if you're if your patient has a spinal injury, we're going to teach you how to properly move them. But you have to be very careful without bending the spine and compromising the spine, okay? So the reason behind that is if your patient, let's just say, they already have a lot of injuries and their spine is already damaged, and you don't take care of that spine, you can probably cause more injuries or paralyze your patient. That's why you have to, if they have a suspected, note it says suspected. So even if you think that they do have one, it's better to be safe than sorry, right? Another type of moving a patient is through patients with no suspected spine injuries, and those different types of lift. You have the extremity lift, the direct ground lift, the draw sheet method, and the direct carry. And all of this is also listed on your textbook, and they have pictures for it, so I'm not going to demonstrate those things for you. But the way to remember this, extremity lift, you basically hold them on their extremities, okay? Direct ground lift is almost like you're carrying them from the ground, okay, and then you're standing up. Draw sheet method is the one where you're using those bed sheets that they do have at home and then transferring them to the stretcher, okay? So those are the different examples of lifting methods for those that don't have a spine injury, okay? And then how do we position our patients? Well, your patients can be positioned in several ways. If your patient is unresponsive and does not have a spine injury, you can place them in the recovery position, right? Because a patient who's unresponsive can throw up. So it's better to put them in the recovery position, okay? If they cannot breathe, you can put them in a Fowler or semi-Fowler position, right? And if a patient is in shock, the best position for a patient in shock is the supine position. I know for my Air Force in the house, they taught you in a BMT or in Camp Bullis to raise the leg. That is actually incorrect, because you don't want to increase the chances of damaging their spine. So you want to make sure that patient in shock is in supine position, okay? And that's basically a quick review of chapter 3. Any questions? Is that pretty clear, class? Right, good. All right, let's move on to chapter 4, medical and legal ethics, right? Medical legal ethics. Let's talk about scope of practice. So scope of practice and standard of care, what's the difference? Scope of practice is what you can do as an EMT, right? So scope of practice says right here, set of regulations that define the scope or limits of the EMTs. This is what I can do. So if you're an EMT, if you're EMT and advanced EMT, as an EMT, can I give IV drugs? No, because that's not within your scope. Can you get in trouble if you give IV drugs as an EMT and you're not an AMT? Yes. So that's basically the scope of practice. The standard of care is basically what would you do in a given situation? So an example of this is when a patient is passed out, automatically, when the patient is not breathing, does not have a pulse, and is not responding, the standard of care is, hey, you need to start CPR, right? So that's basically, that's the difference between standard of care and scope of practice. So scope of practice, what are my limits? What can I do? Standard of care is what should I do at a given point, at a given scenario, okay? Makes sense, everyone? All right, let's move on to patient consent and refusal. Consent is very important from your patient. This is basically asking your patient, is it okay, can I help you? Is it okay for me to help you? Consent is very important, and identifying yourself. Because if you don't identify yourself and you just start touching your patient, they can technically sue you, okay? Because they never told you that you can help them out. A good type of consent is called an express consent. That's basically saying that, hey, this is what we're gonna do to you. I think this is better for us to go to the hospital. Are you okay with that? And then if they agree, that's called an express consent, right? And then the implied consent, this is for those individuals that are not, that are unresponsive, but you're assuming that if they were, they would be okay with helping them, helping them out. So that's called an implied consent, okay? Implied consent is also given to those minors. So let's say a 6-year-old, the parent's not there, and the 6-year-old is severely injured, and you have to treat them. So that's also an example of an implied consent, because you're assuming that if the parent or the guardian was there, they would be okay with that. Okay. Right. Then we also have what we call in loco parentis, basically in place of a parent. So these are basically something that they place on caregivers that it's very common actually for military parents. They give their grandparents authority to make decisions for the child. So that's called an in loco parentis, right? Involuntary transportation. Can we transport a patient against their will? Yes or no? Seeing a lot of no's. Actually, you can, right? You can transport the patient against their will if they are a harm to themselves and to others, and if you can prove that they are not, they are mentally incompetent, right? And that's very hard to prove. And you also need medical direction for this. So you can't just drag somebody's like, you know what, you're acting crazy right now, ma'am, so I'm gonna have to bring you down and transport you. No, just because they have an attitude or they're acting crazy doesn't mean that you bring them down. So the answer is yes, you can involuntarily transport them as long as medical direction and law enforcement has been approved, and that you've proven that the patient is mentally incompetent because they are harm to themselves or to others. Okay. So what do you do when a patient refuses care? Are you just gonna twist their wrists, or are you just gonna tranquilize them and hey, throw them at the back of the ambulance? Probably not a good idea, right? So when a patient is refusing, you have several steps that you can do. On page 82 is actually what we do in the EMT field. First, you want to talk with the patient, spend time. Well, if you don't do this, right, these are the possible consequences. So letting them know what are the consequences if they don't go with you. And then call your medical direction and ask the patient is it okay if I call a family member, because I think that you really need to go. And then if you've exhausted all your resources, and if you think that the patient is mentally incompetent and a harm to themselves or others, then you have to call law enforcement. Why do you have to call law enforcement? Well, law enforcement are the ones that are actually trained to properly and legally restrain a patient. We cannot restrain a patient ourselves without the law enforcement. And you'll learn that when we get to Mod 4, once we get to behavioral emergencies, okay? Right. Then we have two terms here called assault and battery. Assault basically means placing fear on them, right? So basically saying, ma'am, if you don't come with me, I'm gonna cut you, right? So that's basically assault. When you actually cut them and you place your hands on them, that's called battery. Does that make sense? Great. Now let's move on to DNR and advanced directive. So DNR basically means do not resuscitate order. These are individuals that determined that, hey, if in the event of I stop breathing, I don't have a pulse, I don't respond, I don't want you to start CPR on me. The main thing about this is you cannot assume, let's say, for example, a husband called and says, hey, my wife passed out and they got there and the EMT is about to start CPR. And it's like, oh, no, don't worry about CPR. My wife has a DNR. You can't just say, oh, okay, cool. No, you have to see the actual paperwork that says that the patient has a DNR. Okay, and a DNR is an example of an advanced directive. Advanced directives are basically anything that the patient has provided and written even before the event happened. That's why it's called an advanced directive. Okay, so any questions for that class? Yes, what's the question?
So HM1, there was a thing on the questions in our homework where if they signed the the DNR and then he passed out after signing the DNR and then his wife told him to what do we do, and we still give the care after after he signed the DNR and fainted. So it was a big question mark.
I have to look up that question on chapter 4, but I'll get back to you on that one, right? Because I don't want to give the wrong answer, but I'll look it up. once I give you guys on the next break, okay? All right. Right, so let's move on to other legal issues. So we have a thing called negligence, right? Negligence is basically if you fail to act accordingly within your standard of care and scope of practice, you are considered negligent. If you look at on page 88, 3 things need to happen. You have to be on duty. You didn't provide standard of care, okay, and there was a concept that resulted in the patient's harm. So negligence can be, for example, when you're bringing the patient on a stretcher and then all of a sudden you drop the patient from the stretcher. That's considered negligence, right? Because you were on duty and you didn't act accordingly within the standard of care, okay? Right. The duty to act is basically an obligation to provide care to a patient. So duty to act basically means somebody who has been called to help a patient out. So let me give you a scenario. I got called. I needed to respond to a restaurant to where a 50-year-old man had a heart attack. On my way there, I noticed that there was a car pileup. Who does my duty to act fall under? Is it to the 50-year-old man, or is it to the car pileup that I just passed by?
The 50-year-old man.
The what? The 50-year-old man. Very good. Because you can, however, as an EMT, call in the dispatcher, here, there was a pileup that I just passed by. Because remember, you're the EMT that have been dispatched, the 50-year-old man. So you want to make sure that your duty to act relies on that one. Because if you stopped and help up the car pileup, yes, good on you. But your duty to act was you were negligent because you left your 50-year-old man patient who was expecting you there. Okay, so just want to give you guys that idea as well. We also have a thing called abandonment. Abandonment is basically when you leave a patient or you turn them over to somebody who has a lower level of care. When you're transferring a patient, they have to be within the same level or have a higher level of care. So if you're an EMT, you need to turn it over to somebody who is also an EMT or an advanced EMT. I can't turn them over to an EMR. That's a big no-no right there. Or another example of abandonment, you get to the ER and then you just say, hey, Nurse Jackie, here's my patient, peace out. That's also called abandonment. Bye, Felicia, pretty much. Okay. And then we have Good Samaritan laws, right? Good Samaritan laws are basically laws that will protect you as an EMT to, in the event that you want to, not as an EMT, that will protect you as a citizen in case you save somebody. So once you guys are a hospital corpsman, right, once you graduate here, or even if you haven't graduated and you were trained to save somebody's life and you did, let's just say you were doing CPR and you broke their rib. Good Samaritan law will protect you if you were off duty. Okay, note it says off duty because you cannot pull the Good Samaritan card if you are on duty. Let's just say, oh shit, I broke the patient's rib. Oh, Good Samaritan law. Okay, I'm protected. Not really, because you were on duty and you were being negligent, right? So that's why Good Samaritan laws only apply to a citizen, such as yourself, and if you're an EMT, if you were off duty, okay? Any questions for that class? I thought a visual was happening when we got to. Shut your mouth. I will decide when the visual will come up. Needy, needy, needy. Okay, next, confidentiality. Confidentiality is very important, okay? You need to respect your patient's confidentiality. Let me give you an example. Our president, let's just say our president. I know I'm using our governor, there we go, more realistic. The governor was hospitalized and you were the EMT. And then the wife said, hey, you know, that's my husband in there. I need to see his medical record. I want to make sure that he doesn't have history of, you know, STDs or whatever. So can you give that to the wife? Because that is her husband. Can you disclose all their medical history? No, you can't. You can't do that unless the husband unless the husband's life is in specific danger, you cannot just disclose information even to family relatives, because that is patient privacy right there. And once you guys take the hospital corpsman oath and the aerospace medical technician oath, part of that is privacy on there, right? Shelby, you raised your hand. You had a question? No? Okay, then stop raising your hand. Right. Next, HIPAA. HIPAA is basically stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Again, HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is the law. When you break it, you will get fined as a healthcare provider, and you might even go to prison because of it. Okay, so HIPAA is the one that protects the patient's confidentiality. Okay. Then we have libel and slander. Libel is, let's just say you wrote somewhere, okay, that, HM1 Abreu is such a loser, right? So that's libel, okay? Slander is if you're like spreading by word of mouth, okay? That's like, oh my gosh, he is, he's so bad, he's like, he is not giving us coffee, he's such a bitch, wants us to stay up in his class, wants us to be squared away all the time. That's basically slander right there, okay? Right, next, organ donors. If your patients are organ donors, are you just not gonna save your patient? No, very good. So if your patients are organ donors, it specifically states in your textbook, don't assume that, okay, well, his heart is gonna be given to somebody else, so let's not save him. No, still, make sure that you try to save the patient and treat them like a regular patient, right? And if you've done everything you can, then that's when you're going to say, okay, we've done everything we can. We're just going to transport them. And that's when you're going to call the hospital to help them out, okay? And next, last but not the least, crime scenes. As an EMT, you do not, okay, you have no part whatsoever in assisting with the crime scene, right? You are not going to be, collecting thumbprints, and you're not going to, help solve a crime no matter how bad you want it, right? Let me give you another example. Let's just say the chief police, right? The chief police says, hold on right there, EMT Schmuckatelli. You can't transfer the patient yet. We need to take pictures of the hand marks on the patient's neck. Are you going to listen to the chief police and say, okay, sure, go ahead? Exactly. No, you're going to say, bye, Felicia. I need to transport my patient right away, because your duty is to the patient. You need to transport your patient. Your duty is a medical, okay? It's all medical obligations, right? They can go to the hospital and take the pictures, whatever pictures that they need, okay? Another thing that you can do as an EMT, if you know it is a crime scene, don't mess up the crime scene, right? Don't be flipping mattresses if you don't have to. Like, where's that freaking insulin for Granny Smith? Be cautious, right? Be careful what you step on, and try to minimize your impact on the crime scene as well. And then last but not the least, special reporting requirements. If your patient is sexually abused, or if they were sexually abused or neglected, you are a mandated reporter. Okay, you have to report it. It is not a question. Okay, you have to report that to your medical director and to the state, because that is considered a crime. Okay. Any questions with that? Right. Very good. So we're now on chapter 5. Chapter 5. So those 1 through 4. They're like very basic, but I still want to make sure that you guys understood that. So now we're going to go through 5, 6, and 7. Right. Let's go to chapter 5. Right. Chapter 5. Medical terminologies. Okay. So for medical terminologies, one thing that I do want you guys, that I hope you guys are doing over the weekend, is that you're memorizing table 5, memorizing and practicing table 5 tech 1, okay? So what are the different types of root words, prefixes, and suffixes, okay? So please, please, please do not make up your own medical terms, such as tachy, hyper, tension, cap cart. Like, it's not, I'm not telling you to do that. What I'm telling you to do is look up medical words and see if you can identify them by this table alone. So when we say dyspnea, okay, for those of you that have a capability to type, okay, when we say dyspnea, what is that? What is dyspnea? Dyspnea, D-Y, and type it up, D-I-S-P-N-A. What is that?
Difficulty in breathing.
There we go, difficulty breathing, okay. What if I say tachycardia?
Slow heartbeat. I mean, fast heartbeat.
Fast heartbeat. Very good. So simple things like that, you need to be able to identify because these are basic terminologies, right? When you take Mod 1, that is what is expected of you, to know these basic terminologies, okay? Right, let's move on. We also have some acronyms and abbreviations, right? The only abbreviation that this chapter specifically mentioned is CPAP. CPAP stands for continuous positive airway pressure, right? And then you have acronyms such as the DNR. We already talked about that, do not resuscitate, right? So when do we use medical terms and when should we not use it? Well, you're not going to use medical terms if you're talking to the patient or to the family members, right? You don't want them to get lost in the sauce. You want them to be able to identify what you're talking about, right? So don't be like, oh, don't be that person who just mentions random words just to sound smart, right? Because you know you have that type of friend who's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Shut up. Okay, that's what your patients are basically doing. Yeah, that's you, Duplessis. We know. Right, so let's talk about the directional terms and the anatomical positions. All right, so this one, yeah, definitely I'm gonna need the video for this. Let me turn on the video.
Booyah.
All right, everybody can see me? I know. I'm pretty good looking. I know, we know that. Calm down, everybody. All right, so for the medical terms and terminologies, right? So the patient who is standing, standing with their foot on the ground, palms forward, right? That's the anatomical position. When you are being asked a question on the test, always think anatomical position. That means your patient's left is your right, your patient's right is your left, okay? Please be careful with anatomical positions. A lot of students get lost just because they're thinking my left is your patient's left. That is incorrect, okay? So we have different types of directional terms on here. We have midline. So midline is basically the half of the body, right? So midline right here. Okay, and we have anything that is close to the center, that's called midline. Anything that's outside or further away from the midline, that's called lateral right there, right? So midline, that's medial, okay, medial and then lateral. So midline is on the center, anything close to it is medial, and anything toward outside is lateral. So for example, if I say there is a lateral laceration on the left of the patient's face. So that basically means there is a laceration probably right here on the patient's left. Okay, and then we have bilateral. Bilateral means both sides. So bilateral damage to the eyes. Okay, so that's unilateral means one side. Okay, unilateral is one side. Then we have mid-axillary. Mid-axillary basically means from the armpit all the way down to the ankle, right? And then the middle of that. However, when I was teaching Bravo, the mid-axillary is the one right here between your armpit and your hip. That's where you want to put the mid-axillary because that's where you're going to listen to when it comes to the long sounds. But your textbook wants you to identify that the mid-axillary is the hip area, okay? Then we have anterior. Anterior is front, posterior is back. Okay, pretty simple. Anterior, posterior. Then ventral is also front, and then dorsal is back. And then you have superior. Superior is above, inferior is below. Okay, so superior, the nose is superior to the chin is inferior to the lip. Okay. Then proximal. Proximal is anything that is close to the torso. Okay, so anything that is towards the torso, that is proximal. Anything that is further away from the torso, that is distal. So for example, if I'm comparing my elbow and wrist, is the elbow proximal or distal?
Proximal.
Very good. The elbow is proximal because the elbow is closer to the torso compared to the wrist. Now, if I'm comparing the wrist to the elbow, is the wrist distal or proximal? Distal. Very good, because the wrist is now distal. It's further away from the torso compared to the elbow, right? And when we say torso, that's just basically if you chop off the head, the arms, and the legs, that's the torso, right? Then we have palmar. Palmar is basically right here on your palms, and then plantar is the one on the sole of your feet, okay? Then you have mid-clavicular. Mid-clavicular, when you touch your collarbones, right? In the middle of that, that's the mid-clavicular, right? And you have two of those. You have bilateral sides of the mid-clavicular, okay? And then you have the abdominal quadrants, okay? So I'm gonna share screen for those of you that are on the phones. If you're not seeing me, again, there's gonna be a video for this, but I'm gonna do a share screen and I'm gonna draw again our GLASS acronym to remember what's important onto the for the abdominal area, right? So I don't have a fancy computer, so forgive me if boom, boom. That's the 4 quadrants, right? This is your right. Jesus fucking Christ, it's so fucking hard to write. Right upper, okay. This is the right lower. Oh God, this is so hard. And then you have your left upper quadrant, and then you have your left lower quadrant, right? So we have the GLASS acronym, right? G, L, and then you have your A right here, and then you have your 2 S's on the left upper quadrant, okay? This G right here, this is your gallbladder. L is your liver on the right upper quadrants, okay? And then you have on the right lower quadrant is the appendix, and then the left upper quadrant is the stomach and the spleen. Well, HM1, I'm looking at the book right now. There's more than that. I know that, but these are the important and the most vital organs that you need to be concerned with when your patient is experiencing, when your patient is experiencing some complaints or some injuries to those areas. Okay, so does that make sense, class? Right. Sorry, it's so hard to write with the mouse pad. All right. Right, so that's your GLASS acronym for the left for the quadrant. So if I ask you what is, your patient is complaining of severe sharp pain on the right lower quadrant, what possible organ is affected?
Appendicitis.
Very good, appendix. Okay, thank you, shut up. Okay, jeez, motherfucking Christ. Okay. All right, then we have the positional turns. Patient laying on their back is supine. Patient laying face down is prone, and patient laying on their side is the recovery position, preferably on the left side, left lateral recumbent position. And as explained, because on your right side, your inferior vena cava is there. So when you lay on your right side, it pushes down on the inferior vena cava, causing your blood pressure to drop. So you want to make sure that when they're in the recovery position, you place them on their left so that it relieves that pressure right there. This is why pregnant women lay on their left side, because it releases that pressure from the inferior vena cava. Okay, and that's basically chapter 5. Any questions with that, class? Right. Safe to move on to 6. Everybody who's safe for 6. No questions, right? Like I said, if you guys have questions, type away, ask away. Also, as a reminder for those of you that came in the middle of it, just because HM1 Abreu doesn't cover it does not mean that it's not going to be on the test, right? I'm just highlighting certain things. I'm trying to cover as much as I can, but please do not think for a second that I don't cover it. It's not included, okay? All right, so let's move on to chapter 6. We talked about anatomy and physiology. So anatomy is the study of the structure. Physiology is the study of the function, right? Anatomy is where is that? Physiology is how it works. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to break it down by systems, right? Starting with the musculoskeletal system, right? The musculoskeletal system is responsible for giving you that form, that function, and that movement, right? So I'm going to do this whole thing right here. Okay, so this whole bone, right? These whole set of bones, this is called the what?
Skull.
Skull, very good. This is your skull. Oh, hold on, there was a question. Please explain the torso again. Okay, the torso is basically if you cut off your head, your arms and your legs, that's your torso area. Okay, those are all parts of your torso. Is that clear? To answer your question? Yes, no? Okay, fuck me, right? No response, good to go. I answer your question and you leave me hanging. That's a wrap, bruh. Okay. All right, so this is the skull, right? And then we have the cranium. The cranium is basically the top, the back, and the side portion. So if you think of cranium, it's like the crown, right? And then you have the mandible, lower jaw. Okay, you have your maxilla, upper jaw. And then you have your nasal bones. And then you have your zygomatic arches. These are your cheekbones. Mine's not too defined. Okay, and then you have you also have your orbits. Those are the ones for your eye sockets. Okay, and then you have your vertebrae. Okay, your vertebrae consists of how many bones? 33, right? You have 33 bones. It also has 5 regions, right? C, T, L, S, C. Check those long, sexy coccyx, right? C is for cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccyx, right? And it's just like the HM1 Abreu story, 712, 554, right? What time do we eat breakfast? 7. What time's lunch? 12. Dinner is at 5. You eat dessert at 5 as well. And then you come home from the club at 4 a.m., right? So 7 for the cervical, 12 for the thoracic, 5 for lumbar, 5 for sacral, and 4 for coccyx, okay? Also known as the tailbone. Then we also have the thorax. We already talked about that. That's your chest area. Then your sternum. The sternum is like the dagger-looking thing right here on your chest. That's also known as the breastbone. The superior portion of the sternum is the, what is it? Manubrium. Very good. And then the middle is the body. And then the bottom part is the xiphoid process, okay? Then you also have the pelvis. The pelvis is basically your hip bone, so the pelvis area. If you look at the pelvis, it's like a butterfly. So the superior portion of the pelvis is the ilium. The bottom part is the ischium, and the middle part is the pubis. So pelvis, ilium, superior. Inferior is ischium, and then pubis. Okay, and then we also have where the one that the femur that attaches to the hip. So you have the femur, and this is your pelvis. Okay, that is called the acetabellum. Okay, so that's basically the one that connects the hip and the femur. Okay, and speaking of the femur, let's start with the lower extremities. Okay, the lower extremities, that big bone, that biggest and largest bone of your body is called the femur. Okay. And then you have the you have your kneecap, also known as the patella, right? And then underneath that, you have basically your tibia and your fibula, okay? So tibia and fibula. Then you have your malleolus, okay? So your malleolus are those protrusions. I would show you my feet, but I didn't get a pedicure, so I don't want to see you. I don't want you to see my koala claws. But the malleolus are your protrusions on your feet. You have your own set of feet, so you can touch your own feet. The malleolus are lateral and medial, so those are the 2 bumps on your feet right there, okay? And then you also have your tarsals. Tarsals are your ankle bones. Metatarsals are your foot bones. Phalanges are your toes, and then your heel bone is calcaneus. Then you have your upper extremities. Upper extremities, collarbone is your clavicle right here, clavicle, okay? Then you have your shoulder blade at the back, the one that looks like a triangle, that's your scapula. Okay, and then you have when the clavicle and the scapula connects, that's called the acromioclavicular joint. Okay, acromioclavicular joint is the most frequently injured thing on your upper extremity, because when you fall, right, you bump in, that's the one that falls, that's the one where you land, so it breaks. That's the acromioclavicular joint, okay? Then you have your humerus, basically right here, okay, out of the tibia and fibula. I'm sorry, which one is that? Williams, what do you mean out of the tibia and fibula?
Which one is larger, the tibia or the fibula?
Oh, sure, no problem. The one that's larger is the tibula. Okay, tibula is bigger than the fibula. Okay, so the tib is bigger than fib. Okay. All right, moving on. So you have your humerus. Humerus is basically this bone in your upper arm, okay? And then you have, anatomically speaking, the bone right here underneath your thumb, that's the radius, and the bone by your pinky, that's your ulna, okay? And then you have your wrist bones, carpals. Your hand bones are your metacarpals, and then your fingers are your phalanges, okay? Right, and then we have joints are basically the two bones that come together. Speaking of two bones coming together, bone to bone is ligament, muscle to bone is tendon, right? Then we have the muscles. Any questions with the bones at all?
Hey, that works, that works.
Okay, all right. Mesa, tough tibula, fragile fibula. Oh, that's a pretty good way to remember it. Right. We have the muscles, right? So for the muscles, we have three types: voluntary or skeletal, involuntary or smooth, and then we have the cardiac. Okay, so in muscles, for voluntary muscle, think of everything that you work out. So your biceps, your triceps, your calves, right? Your quadriceps. Okay, duplessis, I don't see anything, so I don't know why you flex them, bruh. Nothing. Then we have the involuntary muscles, okay? Involuntary muscles are basically the muscles in your gastrointestinal tract. So when you eat, okay, and then that's moving down, it's because of those muscles inside the gastrointestinal tract, okay? You don't have to consciously control them, because your brain sends the signals to do that, okay? And then you have another special type of muscle, which is the cardiac muscle. Yes, the muscle the heart muscle is very special. It also beats on its own because of a thing called automaticity. Okay, that's why it's beating on its own, and also because of the electrical conduction system. Okay, so any questions with the musculoskeletal system? Everybody good, right? So make sure you guys are practicing this tomorrow, okay, all day when you guys bump into each other, tibia, fibula, and all that good stuff, okay? All right, let's talk about the respiratory system. We have the mouth and nose, part of the respiratory system, because that's where you breathe through. If it goes through the mouth, so if you inhale through the mouth, that's called the oropharynx. If it's through the nose, that's your that's your nasopharynx, right? And then you have the epiglottis. Epiglottis is basically the opening in the trachea. So remember, for like the example that I gave to Bravo, is when you're drinking or eating and you accidentally choke, okay? That's because the epiglottis probably failed to close down, right? It's partially open, so it went through the trachea. So that's why you coughed and choked on yourself a little bit, okay? Then you have the larynx, okay? The larynx is basically also known as the voice box. And the one that protects the lower part of the larynx is your cricoid cartilage. And you can see that predominantly in males. For females, it's hard to see it, okay? Then you have your trachea. Trachea is known as the windpipe, okay? It's the one that connects it to the lungs. After the trachea, it bifurcates, or it separates into two tubes called the bronchi, and then it branches out into smaller branches called the bronchioles, and it ends up into alveoli, okay? And alveoli are microscopic, and it's where the exchange happens between the blood and the alveoli for the carbon dioxide and the oxygen, okay? The major organ for respiration is the diaphragm. Many people think it's the lungs. It's actually the diaphragm, okay? Then there's two concepts here that I want you to fully understand: inhalation and exhalation. HM1, that's pretty easy. But like I said, I want you to understand what happens in inhalation, what happens in the exhalation. In inhalation, the lungs expand, okay? Isn't the larynx the voice box? Yes, it is. That's what I said, right? Okay. Okay, you made me question myself for a little bit. Yes, larynx is the voice box. All right, so going back to the respiratory, to the physiology of breathing. Inhalation, your lungs expands, your diaphragm pulls downward, a negative pressure gets created, and it's an active process. Because if you think about it, it takes a lot to inhale and take in air, okay? Exhalation is a passive process, okay? Your lungs decompress, your diaphragm relaxes, and it creates a positive pressure. So it's the exact opposite of inhalation. But I need you guys to know those key components right there, okay? And then we also have other two terms right here, ventilation and respiration. Ventilation is the simple moving. Inhale, exhale, that's ventilation. Respiration is when the alveoli exchanges gases with the bloodstream. That's called respiration, okay? So we don't see that because it happens in a cellular level, okay? And then the book also asks you to identify what's the main difference between a child's airway anatomy and an adult. Well, a child's anatomy, their nose or mouth are a lot smaller, right? Their trachea is a lot more flexible. Their chests and their cricoid cartilage are also not fully developed, and therefore they're also very flexible, right? And they're prone to getting airway obstruction, right? Because what do kids like doing, right? They put everything in their mouth and then it gets stuck, okay? Right. So that is for your respiratory system. Any questions with that? Pretty clear? All right. Like I said, if you guys have questions, type away and or just scream out your answer, your questions if you're on the phone. Okay. Okay. Moving on. We have the cardiovascular system. I'm gonna send you the. I'm gonna send another email of the drawing that I provided to Bravo. I'm pretty sure Mr. Andy provided it as well, but just in case, so you have it in your notes. I'm not gonna go over that, but I'm gonna verbally walk you through the flow of the blood because you need to know the flow of the blood. I'm telling you right now, that is a very important concept that you have to know starting now in your medical careers. Okay, so was that your drawing right there? You guys drew it in a big paper. Okay, good. So everybody has it. Wonderful. If you guys don't have it, don't worry. I will make sure that that gets emailed out to you no later than midnight tonight. Okay, Alpha, did you guys have that drawing? No? Okay. I'll provide one for you guys. I will also include in the email to ask your Bravo counterparts. I'll try to create a video on it. I'll try my best, but it's so hard to draw using the keyboards, or I mean the mouse pad on my laptop. So I'll just draw it by hand and create a video about it. Okay, so but the flow of the blood, the heart has 4 chambers. The upper chambers are the atriums, the lower chambers the ventricles, right? So the blood comes from, and you can probably, when you're reading the drawing, you can probably listen to this video again, right? So it comes from the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, and then it jumps into the right atrium. Okay, and then from the right atrium, it goes through a first valve. It's the first valve stop called tricuspid. And it goes through the right ventricle. Then from the right ventricle, it goes to a second stop valve called the pulmonary valve because it connects to the pulmonary artery. And then it goes to the lungs where gas exchange happens. From the lungs, it gets delivered, that blood gets delivered back to the heart via the pulmonary vein. And it goes to the left atrium. The left atrium, then it passes through another third stop valve called the mitral or the bicuspid valve. The mitral valve will then pass that on to the most important chamber of the heart, which is the left ventricle. The left ventricle then passes it on to the aortic valve, which is connected to the aorta, and the aorta branches out to all the arteries in the body. Okay, and then that's your last stop of your blood. Okay, and then the arteries connects to arterioles. Arterioles connects to capillaries. Capillaries connects to venules. Venules connects to veins. And then the cycle starts all over again. So that's basically the flow of the blood. And like I said, if you need more visualization, stand by on my email on that one, or ask your Bravo counterparts to take a look, and they'll be able to explain that to you as well. Okay, so that's basically the part. The flow of the blood of the heart. Okay.
HM1.
Yes.
Why do we, after the venules, why do we skip over the valve and go straight to the vein? Why doesn't it go to the valve first?
It's actually already assumed that it's already known that it's basically just letting you know that all veins have valves. That's basically it. So it's not a step that it goes through. It's just embedded within your veins. Like, for example, the most common vein that has a valve is right here. When you guys start doing IV on each other, some of you will hit each other's valve, and you'll know that because the catheter is like crumped up a little bit. So there's a lot of valves within your veins that prevents backflow, because what type of blood is in your vein? deoxygenated, and I don't want that to back up. I want that to
It's
stay
a
oxygenated.
live feed
Okay.
from our instructor. So he's doing it with us.
Ramello, can you mute your phone, please?
I'm
Thank you.
trying.
Oh, attitude. I'll mute you, Ramello. You're muted. And you better secure that attitude too, quick. Okay. Let's talk about the different arteries. Okay, so does that answer your question, Williams? Of why the valve, Williams, does that answer your question of why the valve's not included in the process?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, no problem. All right, so now let's talk about the different types of arteries. All arteries carry oxygenated blood, okay, except the pulmonary artery, okay? All arteries carry oxygenated blood except the pulmonary artery. It also carries blood away, so arteries away from the heart, okay? So there's different types of arteries. Coronary artery is the one for the muscles of the heart, right? Because when the blood leaves the heart, the outside of the heart still needs blood because it's a muscle, right? That's the coronary artery. Then you have the aorta. Aorta is the biggest, okay? Think of it as the biggest and thickest and strongest artery in the body, okay? Then you have your pulmonary artery, which is the artery that's connected from the heart, right? That leads to the lungs. It's the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood. Then you have carotid artery, which is your carotid pulse right here, okay?
No, I'm not finished.
And then you have your femoral artery, okay? Femoral artery is the one by your groin area. Then you have brachial, okay? Brachial artery right here, close to your biceps. Then you have your posterior tibial artery. That's the one behind the medial malleolus, right? So your medial malleolus, if you look at your, it's called tibia, right? So all you got to do is locate your tibia, okay? And at the very end of your tibia, right behind your medial malleolus, you're going to feel that pulse right there. It's pretty weak, actually. And then you have your dorsalis pedis on your foot. So if you imagine this is the big toe and this is the index toe, right in the middle is where you're going to feel a pulse. And you guys can do that right now if you're like touching your toe. You're going to feel a pulse right there. Okay. I'm just saying if you are, calm down. Okay. Right. So any questions with that? Okay, very good. Let's move on. Then we have the blood. The blood consists of the plasma, the white blood cells, the red blood cells, and the platelets, right? So the blood, the plasma is the liquid portion of your blood, okay? And then your red blood cells carries oxygen and picks up waste, specifically carbon dioxide. Then you have white blood cells, who's responsible for fighting infection. And then you have the platelets that's responsible for basically clotting factors and mechanisms in your body. Okay. Red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes, and white blood cells are leukocytes. Okay. This is why individuals with leukemia, right? Leukemia, that's basically a deficiency in the white blood cells. Okay. And then we have the different types of pulses. The arteries that we just talked about, all of those are also pulses. The main thing that I want you to know, however, you only have two central pulses, right? The carotid and the femoral. Those are the key pulses in your body. Everything else is peripheral. So when your body's going into shock, the carotid and the femorals are the ones that are probably going to maintain that blood in there because they're the most important ones. Those are your central pulses, okay? So any questions with the blood components and pulses?
HM1.
Yes.
At what point does your white cell blood count, if it goes too high, does it become dangerous to your body? Is there a certain amount of white cell blood count?
I'm not 100% sure what the count is. But basically, the white blood cell, it's not necessarily that the white blood, it can be very dangerous if you have a white blood cell count. It's just basically a signal. If the white blood cell count is really high, it's just saying that there is an infection present. That's basically it. So your body doesn't just produce white blood cells just because. However, I'll look that up for you and then I'll get back to you on that one if there is such a thing called such as excessive white blood cells. I believe there is a term for it, but I just don't have it right now with me. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, no problem. Right. Any more questions? All right, let's move on to blood pressure. Your blood pressure is the measurement of how much the blood is, how much force is in your blood vessels, right? That's a very important thing to know. So there's two types of blood pressures. You have systolic and diastolic. Systolic is when your left ventricle is contracting, okay? Diastolic is when your left ventricle is relaxing and it's refilling. Okay, so those are your two measurements right there. And that's why the first number when you get a blood pressure is your systolic. The second number is your diastolic. Okay. So I'm going to skip over the perfusion and the hyperperfusion because I'm going to repeat that in chapter 7 anyway. So I'm going to skip through that part right there. But I'm going to move on to the lymphatic system. Right, so the lymphatic system, their main responsibility is to collect fluids, maintain fluid balance. Their main job is also to fight infection. That's another thing. They're the backup to the immune system, just in case the immune system fails its part. That's why when you go to the doctor, they check your lymph nodes, they check your tonsils, because there's lymph nodes on those parts of your body. And when they are swollen, it's a sign that there's an infection. That's why tonsillitis, that's an infection of the tonsils, and that's your lymph nodes basically working for you, okay? Then we have the nervous system, okay? So for the nervous system consists of the central and peripheral nervous system. Just like the central pulses, there's only two parts on the central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, then you have your peripheral nervous system, basically your sensory nerves, your motor nerves, and everything else in between those. Okay, underneath your peripheral nervous system, we have a system called autonomic. Autonomic nervous system is very important because it's what's responsible for your automatic responses, such as when you touch something that's hot, you automatically remove that. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for that. Underneath the autonomic nervous system, there's two more, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic nervous system is responsible for stress, right? When you hear sympathetic, I want you to think of stress. And when you're stressed, what happens? Breathing goes up, heart rate goes up, right? It's also known as the fight or flight response, okay? And then you have the parasympathetic. So when you think of parasympathetic, think of paradise. It's like a relaxed environment. So that's when everything's calmed down. Also known as the feed or breathe, right? So when you're relaxed, just like when you're relaxed on the couch, what do? Like munch on things, like feed, right? And then it's also when your body's in a relaxed state, okay, you also have the capability of breeding or reproducing. Okay, so that's why it's the feed or breed response. Okay, any questions with the nervous system or lymphatic system? Everybody good? Thumbs up if you're good. Awesome, awesome. Right, let's move on to the digestive system. Digestive system is responsible for digesting that Oreos that you keep munching on like a fat ass, Shelby. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that out loud. Stomach is basically where digestion starts to happen. Okay, it's the beginning. It's not the final stage. So when you chomp on food, num, 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 the stomach releases acids, blends it, melts it, and then it passes it on to the small intestines. Okay, so for the small intestines, there's three parts into it. Okay, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Okay, those are the three parts of the small intestines. So when you see that on a chapter test review or a homework or on the test, and you see ileum, make sure that you look at it and you don't confuse it with the ones on the pelvis, right? Because they're spelled differently. And then you have the large intestine. Okay, that's basically anything that hasn't been fully digested by the small intestine gets absorbed by the large intestine. And then you have the other accessory organs. You have the liver, which produces bile. And the liver is also known as the largest organ of the body. So anytime you guys see largest, smallest, biggest, thickest, that's probably very important items that you have to remember, okay? And then you have the gallbladder, which stores bile. Then you have pancreas, which is responsible for producing insulin, because insulin helps with the absorption of glucose, as we'll learn in chapter 7. And then you have the spleen. Spleen is the one that is responsible for filtering blood and storing blood as well, okay? And we can live without our spleen. Contrary to popular belief, you can live without your spleen. That's why we have a thing called splenectomy, okay?
And then you have the appendix. There's no known use for it. It says here in your book, there's still no known use of the appendix. They don't understand what it's still used for. However, we do know that when it gets inflamed, it's called an appendicitis, and we have to remove it. Okay, so that is for your digestive system. Any questions with that? Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the integumentary system. Integumentary system is known as basically for your skin. Okay, integumentary system, if you rearrange the letters over there, if you look at your book on page 138, if you rearrange the initial letters of those things, you can create the word swept. So if you think of what's the process of the skin, think of the acronym SWEPT. Shock absorption, water balance, excretion, protection, and temperature regulation. Those are the things that your skin does. Okay? Your skin has 3 layers. Epidermis, which is the outer layer of your skin. Then you have the dermis, where the blood vessels are. And then you have your subcutaneous, where a lot of fat is. Okay, so when you pinch your skin, underneath that, that's where all the subcutaneous layers are. Going back to epidermis, your epidermis has several stratas or layers as well. So throughout your body, you have 4 stratas of epidermis, except for the hands and the feet. Your hands and feet have 5 stratas because it's responsible for friction, right? It comes in contact with a lot of things. Right, any questions with the integumentary system? Okay, good. Now let's move on to endocrine system. Endocrine system is responsible for producing hormones. Okay, it's basically chemical messages in your body that says, hey, it's time to grow. Hey, it's time to accept the sugar. That's basically the endocrine system. Examples of hormones, all right, that are produced by your body, insulin, that's produced by the pancreas. So technically, pancreas is not only part of the digestive, it's also part of the endocrine system. Epinephrine is also a hormone produced by the body. It's also known as adrenaline. So when you get like nervous or when the stress levels are high, that's why you barely notice when people get into an accident and they have like broken arms or anything and everything's still numb. That's because of the adrenaline rush. And once that subsides, okay, now they feel the pain. That's why we have that adrenaline rush, okay? On page 140, those are the only glands that belong to your body. Pineal gland, pituitary gland, thymus gland, thyroid glands, adrenal glands, ovaries, testes, pancreas. Prostate gland is not an endocrine system. Sweat gland is not an endocrine system. So please, just because it says gland does not make it automatically an endocrine system. Does that make sense, class? Right, last 2 systems, renal system and reproductive system. Renal system is responsible for eliminating urine from your body, right? The renal system. Part of these ones are the kidneys. They're just the ones that filter blood and regulate fluid in the body. Then you have your bladder. It basically stores the fluid in your body until it's time to eliminate it. Then you have your ureters. Your ureters is the ones that connects the kidney and the bladder. And then you have your urethra. That's where urine comes out, okay? Urethra is longer for males than into females. And this is like more of an FYI. The reason why females get infections right away, because your urethra is really, really short. So the bacteria can travel from the outside urethra all the way up inside real quick. Males, you have a long urethra. This is why when it takes a while for infection to kick in for males versus females. Okay? Any questions with that one? Right. Now let's go over reproductive system. For male reproductive system, you have the testes and the penis. Okay, like I told Bravo, if you cannot look in the mirror and say penis and vagina without laughing, you cannot get married. Okay? So testes is the male organ that produces sperm, and penis is the organ for reproduction. For the females, you have your ovaries, which basically releases eggs. And then uterus is where the babies develop, where those little creatures start to develop. And then the vagina is the main organ of reproduction for the females. Okay? So that's basically the end of chapter 6. Any questions with that, class? Any questions that help out? Chapter 6, pretty good? Okay, let's go ahead and take 5, and then I'm going to cover 7. This is our last chapter, 7, because chapter 8 will take me 5 minutes to talk about. So chapter 7 is the last one that I do want to talk about. Hang in there, you're almost done, and then we'll go over 8. Sounds good? All right, so 5 minutes.
When I say dedicated, you say motivated.
Shut your mouth.
Motivated.
So pluses, we were ready. Why didn't you say it?
Dedicated.
Motivated.
Motivated.
Dedicated.
Motivated.
Dedicated.
Daddy. It's like dedicated.
Medicated.
Duplexes, why you always gotta be so loud?
Because I'm from the 504 and I'm ignorant.
What is the 504?
I'm from New Orleans and I'm very ignorant.
Who's
And
very ignorant?
Do you have a new cadence?
Yeah, I learned 2 more new cadences today.
Gotta teach us.
A day? You learn 2 a day?
2 days.
We do the mix too. M-I-C-K-E-Y.
I like that one.
M-O-U-S.
We ain't doing that.
Blow, let it blow.
I'm not saying.
Yeah, let the four.
Let the 4 winds blow.
Let the blow.
He's back.
From the east to the west.
My name
Flag 200 is the best.
It's fine.
You know he doesn't have his headphones in yet.
I didn't hear that. What happened?
Shelby, mute your mic.
Rebel, Shelby, rebel.
Mesa, stop it.
No, stop.
Oh, hi. Look, it's a doggy.
It's a dog? What?
Is that what was sneaking around in the back? Because I saw something and then I thought I was just tripping.
There was nothing behind
You were
me.
tripping.
You're tripping.
No, it definitely crawled behind. Look, it didn't crawl, but it walked.
We can't have a dog in here.
It's a fluffy.
He doesn't live in the barracks. It doesn't matter. What are you talking about?
No, you said a dog.
Gang, gang, Gloria, gang, gang.
Oh my God. What are you? Is that cotton candy? What is that?
Bean. What the
Hey,
Look
why?
at Hugo. Look at
All
Hugo.
right, shut up, everybody. This is my room, my rules. Okay. Right, so let's go ahead and begin chapter 7. Ventilation perfusion. I know Alpha, you guys haven't covered this, right? A little bit. You guys haven't started it yet? Did you start it or no? Yes or no?
Yes, HM1.
You started it already, but did you guys finish it?
No, HM1.
No, a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and cover it now. So let's start with chapter 7, the cell. So the cell is the basic unit of life. The book all mentions several parts of the cell that you need to know. Please do not worry about the other things that are not mentioned within the paragraph. So you have the cell membrane. The cell membrane is the protection, right? Remember, bouncer of the cell, it allows things to come in and out. It has that factor called permeability. Then you have the mitochondria. Mitochondria is responsible for producing adenosine triphosphate, which basically is the currency for energy. Okay, and then you have the endoplasmic reticulum. Endoplasmic reticulum is responsible for producing proteins for the body because proteins is needed. Your nails, the color of your hair, your eyes, all those are basically basic structures of protein right there. Okay. And then you also have, so we talked about the cell membrane, the cell membrane, the mitochondria. Okay, then we also have the nucleus. Okay, so the nucleus is responsible for containing the DNA. Each cell has a DNA. Okay, it's responsible for basically reproducing and multiplying, and that's the main job of the nucleus right there. All right, so those are the basic parts of the cell. Cell membrane, nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria. Know those four, know what they do. Then we have a term called metabolism. Metabolism is the breakdown of nutrients to convert it into energy. There's two types of metabolisms, right? There's an aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism, okay? Aerobic metabolism is when there is presence of oxygen. This is actually, I don't want you to think that anaerobic is bad. Your body uses both. Every day, your body uses both. The aerobic metabolism is just when there's a lot of oxygen that your cells uses, which is good because more oxygen, more energy, okay? So that's the byproduct of aerobic metabolism is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. If there is anaerobic, that means there's no presence of oxygen. A little bit of energy gets produced, but there's a lot of byproduct waste called lactic acid that gets produced. So the example that I gave the class, when you're working out, right? When you're lifting weights, there are certain points in time in your workouts where you hold your breath multiple times, or when you're even running. So those holding your breath and those pauses, okay, that you do, those are examples of anaerobic metabolism. So this is why after workouts or runs, you're quite sore because there's a presence of lactic acid on there. Okay, so that's the metabolism, and that's the importance of oxygen as well. So oxygen is needed to basically help with ATP production. More oxygen, better for your cells because it produces energy. So oxygen is one of the things that your cell needs. The other two that it needs is water and glucose. So let's talk about water. We already talked about the oxygen. Water is needed because, one, we need it because you need it to survive. But your cells need it specifically because it helps break down electrolytes that you've been intaking in your body. Okay, electrolytes is this common word that you hear in Gatorade or whatever drinks, right? So electrolytes is needed because when you break down electrolytes, it helps with the electrical system of your body. Well, what are these electrical systems in your body? We already talked about this. The heart has an electrical system. The brain and the spinal cord and your nerves have electrical system. So this is why water is important because you need to break them down, okay? So oxygen, check. Water, check. Glucose. Why is glucose essential? Well, glucose is essential because one of the main ingredients of adenosine triphosphate is glucose. You cannot make ATP without the presence of glucose. So this is why if you don't eat, if you skip meals, that's why you're lethargic. You feel weak. You don't feel like doing anything, right? That's because there's absence of glucose, hence absence of energy. So does that make sense, everybody? For the glucose, water, and oxygen.
Actually, no, I have a question.
Sure.
About the aerobic metabolism, you said something to do with ATP. What was that?
Yes. So with the aerobic metabolism, there's presence of oxygen in there. So when there's presence of oxygen, it produces ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's what it does. The mitochondria, it's just like giving out ATP because there's high amounts of oxygen, given the fact that there's also glucose present. Anaerobic, there's not enough oxygen, so therefore the mitochondria barely produces any energy, but it produces a lot of lactic acid. Does that make sense, Williams?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, so moving on. Let's talk about the cardiopulmonary system, right? So now we talked about the basic stuff, which is the cell. Like I said, know the parts of the cell, know the the importance of water, glucose, and oxygen, which we already did. So let's talk about cardiopulmonary system. Cardiopulmonary system is a combination of two systems, or two. Okay, cardiovascular and the respiratory system. The book gave an introduction about the respiratory system first. The air that you inhale is only 21% oxygen. 79 of it is actually nitrogen. Okay, so that gives you like, oh wow, that's not a lot of oxygen, right? That is called the fraction of inspired oxygen, or FiO2. how much oxygen are you actually intaking? So that is FiO2. And to answer your question, 21% out of the 100. Okay. So what is the proper flow of the airway? Okay, I'm going to repeat this twice so you guys remember this, and it's embedded in your head. Okay, the proper flow of the airway. Okay, because you're going to hear this again in mod 2, so I want you to know now. Okay, so it starts with the mouth or nose, the oropharynx or nasopharynx. Okay, and then you have your hypopharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli. Let me say that again. Starts with the mouth or nose, oropharynx or nasopharynx, hypopharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli. That's the proper path of the airway. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? And if you did miss that, like, this will be a recorded session. I'll have it on YouTube. I'll put time frames on there. So if you miss a specific part of what I talked about, all you got to do is click on that time frame and it will bring you to this section once again. Okay. Right. So any compromise in those areas, for example, the larynx. Okay. If you have most commonly your RDCs or MTIs, I believe was what the Air Force calls it, military training instructors, drill instructors, when they shout a lot, they have laryngitis. That's an infection of the larynx, and that's a compromise to their breathing as well. It's not a good thing. Anytime something's compromised between those things, there's an effect of how you take in air, okay? So when there is no obstruction and everything's clear in the airway, we call that a patent airway, okay? So patent, not patent, patent airway. When there's patent airway, that means that air is going to come in through the nose all the way up to the alveoli. That's a good day. There's 3 terms that your book mentioned about here that I want you guys to know. Tidal volume, minute volume, dead air space. Tidal volume is the amount of air that you take in one cycle. That basically means that's tidal volume, okay, in one cycle. Minute volume is the amount of air that I take in 1 minute. That's why it's called minute volume. So when in 1 minute, how fast, depending on how fast I'm breathing, that's called minute volume. Dead air space is a term used for the air that does not reach the alveoli. Because when you take in air, not all of that goes into the alveoli. Some of it sticks around the hypopharynx, probably the trachea, probably the larynx, okay? So those are the basic concepts that I need you to know for the respiratory system that was not discussed in chapter 6. Any questions? Okay, so let's move on. Anytime you see dysfunction or disruption, that's an objective for this chapter. So basically, this chapter talks about pathophysiology. It talks about diseases. So if you don't know the diseases, then you're missing a very important key objective in this chapter, right? So we have, first off, the respiratory dysfunctions. There's only 3 respiratory dysfunctions that your textbook mentioned. You have disruption of respiratory control. That's basically the medulla oblongata, who controls your breathing, is affected by trauma, drugs, infection. Then you have disruption of pressure. That basically means you have a hole on your chest. And if you have a hole in your chest, what are those 2 pressures we talked about? Negative and positive pressure. Those pressures are important for your body in order to fully function. And when you have a hole in your chest, those pressures are not present. And then you have disruption of lung tissue. Okay, that's when you stab somebody in the lungs, okay, and it's injured. When the lung is injured, it's not going to be able to take in air properly. It's not going to be able to expand and collapse. So those are the 3 disruptions. Disruption of respiratory control, disruption of pressure, disruption of lung tissue. Any questions? Okay, so what happens when those disruptions occur? Well, you have a thing in your brain called chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are basically the ones that tell your lungs, hey, listen up, we're low in oxygen here, lungs, breathe faster. This is why when somebody gets stabbed on the chest, their response is, that's called a respiratory compensation. Okay, your body's trying to compensate for something that's lacking, and that's because of the chemoreceptors. Okay, so that's all for your respiratory system. Any questions with that? Okay, let's move on. Now let's talk about the blood. In your blood, there's two pressures called plasma oncotic pressure and hydrostatic pressure. H1, what are those two things? Well, in your blood, there needs to be a balance within the cells, okay? The plasma oncotic pressures are the ones that pull water from the body into the bloodstream. So it pulls water from the cells into the bloodstream. Opposite of that is hydrostatic pressure. So if plasma oncotic pulls, hydrostatic pushes water in. Those two forces need to be a balance, okay? Or else the cells in your body are just gonna inflate with water and explode, or it will shrivel and also die. So it needs to have those presence, okay, within the blood cells, okay, the plasma oncotic pressure and the hydrostatic pressure. So what are the dysfunctions with the blood? Pretty easy. Not enough blood, right? Anemia, or not, is also another example when there's not enough red blood cells. When you don't have enough red blood cells, that means you don't have enough blood cells carrying oxygen to the rest of your body. So that's an example of a blood dysfunction, okay? So any questions with the plasma oncotic pressure or hydrostatic pressure? Okay, so just remember plasma oncotic pushes out, okay? Pushes water from the cells out to the bloodstream. Hydrostatic from the bloodstream inside. All right, let's move on to the blood vessels. The 4 blood vessels that we talked about, right? Or 5 blood vessels that we talked about. Capillaries, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, veins, and venules, right? So we already know their functions. Another thing that this chapter introduced in the blood vessels, we have a thing called stretch receptors. Stretch receptors are responsible for dilating, basically opening, and constricting the blood vessels. So it does that. Okay, your blood vessels does that all day. That's because of your stretch receptors. So the stretch receptors are responsible for identifying the internal pressure. So when you get a finger cut, right? The stretch receptors determine, oh my gosh, there's an opening there. We need to close that up. The stretch receptors tells it to tighten up. Okay, so that's the main job of it. Now, in your blood vessels, there's 3 dysfunctions as well. The first one is loss of tone. You can blame your stretch receptors for that. The loss of tone basically means that the blood vessel stays like this, stays open. Well, so what if it stays open? Well, that's a bad thing because when your blood vessels stay open, your blood pressure goes down. And so what if your blood pressure goes down? Well, you can go into shock. People can die because their blood pressure keeps going down, okay? So that's the one. Next is excessive permeability. That means the blood vessels are leaking, just like the pipes in your homes, in your apartments, in your barracks. If the pipes are leaking, that's not a good day. So excessive permeability happens when you have infection, okay? So that means the blood vessels are becoming weak and things are starting to leak out of it. So that's not a good thing. The last one is hypertension. Everybody knows this because we have a friend, a family member who has it, okay? So high blood pressure is or hypertension happens because of a thing called SVR, systemic vascular resistance. It's basically a pressure in your peripheral blood vessels that the heart has to overcome. HM1, I did not understand that definition. Well, the easiest way I describe this was think of the tide in the ocean, right? The tide is there, right, in the ocean. It could be high tide, it could be low tide. Same thing with the systemic vascular resistance. If there's low tide or if there's normal tide, hey, it's safe, right? But if there's high tide, the news talks about it, the weather forecast talks about it, hey, it's dangerous. Same thing with the systemic vascular resistance. If this is high, that means that the heart has to fight through that, causing your blood pressure to go up, okay? What causes the SVR to go up? Diet, lifestyle choices, your exercise, how active you are. That's what would cause it to go up, okay? So is everybody clear on the systemic vascular resistant concept? Everybody good with that one? Thumbs up if you do. Cool. Right. So now let's move on to the heart. So we talked about the blood. We talked about the blood vessel. Now let's talk about the star of the cardiovascular system, which is the heart, okay? So when your heart beats, okay, it releases about 70 ml of blood. Okay, that's just an average. So when your heart beats, that's called stroke volume. Every time your heart beats, boom, 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 boom. Okay, the blood it ejects in one contraction is called stroke volume. The blood it ejects in 1 minute is called cardiac output. So it's almost the same as the tidal volume, minute volume. Okay. So what affects the stroke volume? There's three things that affects the stroke volume: preload, contractility, and afterload. Preload basically means how much blood is returning to the heart. Okay, it's how much blood is refilling to the heart. The lesser it is, the less blood is going to come in there, right? The contractility is how hard does the heart need to squeeze, okay? Because if the heart doesn't squeeze too strong, not a lot of blood gets pushed out. So your stroke volume goes down. And the afterload is how much pressure does the heart need to fight? Basically, the systemic vascular resistance. If the systemic vascular resistance is high, that means the heart has to work twice as hard in order to overcome that. Okay, so those are the three factors: preload, contractility, and afterload that affects the stroke volume. Is that clear, class? Okay, I'm trying to break it down into like lay terms as much as possible because I know the book kind of has long definitions that can be confusing. Okay, so what's the dysfunction of the heart? Pretty easy. Mechanical, basically problems with the artery. So you've heard of those people that have clogged arteries, a lot of fat in their arteries or blood vessels. That's an example of a mechanical dysfunction. The other dysfunction is electrical. That means the heart stops beating. Okay, and when the heart stops beating, what do? Well, we shock it, right? You're going to learn that in Mod 4 of how to take care of a heart that stops beating. Okay, so what does this all mean together? So putting together cardiopulmonary system, okay? It says right here, if you look on page 164, the VQ match, that's basically the summary of that paragraph. It says right here, this implies that the alveoli are supplied with enough air and that the air in the alveoli is much with sufficient blood in the pulmonary capillaries to permit optimum exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. HM1, what does that mean? Basically, one, in order for you to survive, you need to have enough air or oxygen to breathe in. That oxygen needs to match up with enough blood, okay, in your body in order for you to survive, okay? So equal amounts of oxygen, equal amounts of blood, because there's no point of me to have all the oxygen in the world and I'm bleeding out. That's not a good thing. Or I'm not bleeding out, but you put me in a confined space and I'm suffocating. So there's no match right there. So that means there needs to be enough blood and enough air in order for your patient to survive. And when your body is able to distribute enough oxygen and pick up waste, that's called perfusion. Okay? Perfusion is the supply of oxygen to the tissues and the removal of waste. When that's not happening, that is called hypoperfusion. Okay? It is the inability of the body to distribute oxygen and pick up waste products. Okay? And that is also known as shock. Okay. So any questions with the cardiopulmonary system? Everything else after this is just going to be a pretty quick one. Any questions at all? Okay. Right, so let's move on to shock. Shock, like I said, is the same definition as hypoperfusion. There's 4 types of shock, okay? We have hypovolemic, distributive, cardiogenic, obstructive. Hypovolemic is when there's not enough blood and enough fluids. You go into hypovolemic shock. So those patients that bleed out, okay, those are the ones that experience hypovolemic shock. Distributive shock, if you remember, the stretch receptors, right? So when the stretch receptors tell the blood vessel to stay open, that's called distributive shock because it causes the blood pressure to go down. And part of being in shock is when your blood pressure goes down, okay? Cardiogenic shock, your heart stops beating. So what if your heart stops beating? That basically means not enough blood's getting pushed out to the body. Not enough blood means not enough oxygen in the body. So therefore that is hypoperfusion. So that's cardiogenic shock. And last but not the least is obstructive shock. That means there's a block in the blood vessel. So what if there's a block? Well, if there's a block in the blood vessel, the blood that's carrying oxygen is not being able to come through. So that's also a sign of shock as well. Okay. So any questions with those 4 types of shock? Right. With those 4 types of shock, your body goes into different levels. Okay, it doesn't say in the book, but it goes into different levels. When your body's in shock, it compensates. We call that compensated shock. So if you look at 165, those are the signs of compensated shock. Mental status change, increased heart rate. Okay, that's what it does. your body can only do that for so long. So if your body gets tired, your body goes into what we call decompensated shock, okay? That's actually a bad sign, but you can still somewhat save your patient. But if you don't control that, it goes into what we call irreversible shock, okay? Irreversible shock basically means death, okay? So this is why when you see the signs and symptoms on that specific page that I told you, we need to treat that right away. And we'll teach you how to do that in Mod 4 and Mod 5, okay? But you need to treat that right away. So there's also a term in your book called diaphoresis. Okay, diaphoresis basically means your patient is cool, pale, and kind of sweating bullets, right? That's pale, cool, and clammy. That's diaphoresis right there. So that's basically for your shock. Any questions with compensated, decompensated, or irreversible? Right, so let's move on. Okay, these are like very short systems right here. Let's talk about fluid balance. As you guys know, water is important for the cells. And if you look at it, 70%, your body's made of 60%. 70% of that 60% is inside the cells. That's how important it is, okay? So what happens when there's things that happens to your fluid balance? Page 168. Dehydration is one of the things that happens. That means there's low amounts of water. Another thing that can happen is edema. Edema happens when when the fluid doesn't go where it needs to go, right? So your liver produces proteins called albumin. That's the one that's responsible for pulling water into the cells. Well, if the liver is damaged, what happens is albumin's not present. So therefore the water just goes wherever it wants to go. So that's why you get swollen feet, right? Or if they're laying down, they get like a swollen back. Okay, so that's what we call edema. So that's for your fluid balance. Any questions with those? Right, so like I said, if you know the disruptions, you're basically getting 90% of the objective for this specific chapter. Okay, let's move on to the nervous system. Well, the nervous system, we already know the central, peripheral, so I'm not going to go over that again. But the nervous system can be damaged into two ways. We have a trauma or medical. Trauma is pretty self-explanatory. That's when the spine breaks, or that's when you hit your head and the brain gets shaken up. Those are all examples of trauma. It could also be because of medical, okay? So there's different types of diseases that could cause your nerves to basically waste away. Examples of this are multiple sclerosis, right? That's basically when the nerves are degenerating, okay? You also have Lou Gehrig's disease. So those are all non-trauma related, but they're medical, okay? And signs of these nervous dysfunctions on page 169, I want you guys to look over that. It says right here, altered mental status, seizures, inability or difficulty to speak, inability to walk, paralysis, loss of sensation. All these right here are signs of nervous system dysfunction, okay? So if you notice here, nowhere does it say increase strength or increase anything. Almost everything is decrease, okay? So any questions with the nervous system?
HM1?
Yes.
For say if someone was walking and they jumped and landed on their feet, and for some reason that their ankle just randomly collapsed and like went sideways, would that be like a misfiring of the nerves, or would that just be a muscle failure for like your ankle if it just went to the side automatically and you fell and landed on your side?
Oh, that's just them being weak. I'm kidding. No. The reason why, no, it could be a mix of both. I can't tell you that it's because it's the nerves. Sometimes people with brittle bones, that tends to happen. But I wouldn't discount that as not being part of it, but it can happen. Some individuals, like they just lost all sensation on that specific part, causing their ankle to twist. That's a possibility. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Right, so let's move on. Any questions with the nervous system? We have like 3 systems left, and then we're going to briefly talk about chapter 8. All of you are like, thank God this bitch is about to shut up. Okay, I can read y'all's mind, but guess what? I don't care. I'm helping you out. Okay, so endocrine system. Okay, endocrine system, as we all know, is basically responsible for chemical messages in your body, right? They're responsible for all of that. We have two dysfunctions: too many hormones, too little hormones. Your body needs balance, right? Your body needs balance. Too many hormones, an example of this is the Graves' disease. Graves' disease is a thing that affects your thyroid gland. Well, what's so important about the thyroid gland? Well, your thyroid gland is responsible for your weight, for your body's temperature regulations. If that's affected, those two are affected, okay? There's also a thing called not enough hormones, such as insulin. So what type of individuals, when they don't have enough insulin, what diseases do they get?
Diabetes.
There you go,
Diabetes.
diabetes, okay? So those are the two things that are related to your endocrine system. Then we have our digestive system, okay? The digestive system, we already talked about the different parts of it. What are the two dysfunctions? We have gastrointestinal bleeding. So that's basic. That's not a good thing. Your gastrointestinal bleeding is full of blood vessels, right? So they easily bleed out when it's not taken care of. So for those of you that like skipping meals and are developing ulcers, if you let that go and you don't take care of it, you can essentially develop gastric ulcer bleedings, and it's not a fun sight. Trust me, it hurts a lot. Another dysfunction you can get is vomiting and diarrhea. Why is this part of that? Because vomiting and diarrhea can cause you to have dehydration when you keep throwing up and when you keep pooping, right? So that's going to cause you to lose a lot of fluids, and it also can harm your digestive tract. Okay. Any questions with the digestive system? Right. Last but not the least, we have the immune system. The immune system is responsible for fighting infection in your body. Your immune system specifically, there's a thing called hypersensitivity. Hypersensitivity basically is an exaggerated response of your immune system, such as an allergic reaction. The reason behind this is because the reason why you tear up, for those of you that have seasonal allergies, you tear up, you have those stuffy nose, right? You sneeze a lot. It's because of a chemical that gets released by your immune system called histamines, right? The histamines are the ones that causes the swelling, right? The reason why you swell up when you start itching and tear up, that's because of histamines. And what do we take to get rid of those? Antihistamine, right? That's why they give you Benadryl, Zyrtec, Claritin. All those basically stop what histamines do to your body, because what it does is it produces edema, and it also narrows the airways, okay? And it also causes on page 171, it says right there, one of the chemicals released called histamines produces edema, narrowing of the airways, and it also causes a rapid drop in blood pressure. So it narrows the blood vessels as well. So that's what happens with hypersensitivity, okay? So that is basically like a quick 25-minute of chapter 7. Does that help you guys out? Is that clear with chapter 7, everybody? Okay, Alpha, I know you guys haven't finished this quite yet, but did it help out? Understood? Cool. All right, last but not the least, both classes haven't been through this yet. Okay, so on these chapters, I just want to briefly talk about, I want you guys to create something like this. Right, and it's gonna be beneficial for you. So let me just pull something real quick. Where's Microsoft Office? Microsoft Excel.
HM1.
Yes.
What happens if you drink a certain kind of medicine and you didn't eat yet, and they said it kind of develops some kind of ulcer?
Yeah. So. And a good example of this is Motrin. For those of you that just like pop Motrin like it's candy without eating anything, that's actually not advised, because it can cause some gastric ulcer bleeding, because certain medications can harm the lining of your stomach because they're that strong. You eating prevents that from happening. That's why when the medication says do not take without a meal, it's probably a good idea to follow that, because it's going to harm your stomach lining and can potentially cause some gastric ulcer bleeding. Now, don't start freaking out and going to sick call on Monday and like, I got gastric ulcer bleeding because I just popped 8 Motrins or whatever. Calm the fuck down. It's okay. I'm not telling you specifically, but for those of you that are thinking that. Is that clear? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, HM1.
Okay, good to go. All right, so for those of you, let me do a quick share screen right here. And this is where I'm almost going to end. Share screen. All right, so you can see my Excel spreadsheet right here, right? But you don't have to do an Excel spreadsheet exactly. But what I want you guys to do is put in on your is to create a table, right? To help you better understand. On the first table, I want you to name that table Stages of Life. And then the other table, I want you to put age, right? So age, state of life. And then I want you to put on the other one systolic BP, their respiration, and then their pulse, right? So, for example, for the infancy, that's the first stage of life. What's the age of infancy? Birth to 1 year, okay? So when in birth to 1 year, if you look at each stage of life has a vital signs that ask you to remember. So their systolic blood pressure is 70, right? 70 milligrams at birth. And then it also says after birth, it goes up to 90. Okay, so that's their systolic blood pressure. Their respiration is about 40 to 60 at birth. So that's pretty fast. And then it goes down to 30 to 60 after birth. Okay, and then their heart rate, it's about 140 to 160. Again, I'm not saying that you should memorize this, but what this table will do for you, if you do this for all stages of life, because there's only how many stages? 8 stages, right? If you do this, it will help us on Monday for a better discussion. Okay, so at least if you want to memorize something, I would suggest memorizing the ages, right? So infancy, your toddler years, preschool years, school years, adolescent, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood, right? So you don't have to do it via Excel. You can create your own table and just handwrite it. Okay? So does that make sense, everybody? Right, so again, it's just a suggestion. You don't have to do it. Most students found it a lot helpful to see everything in one piece of paper versus flipping to a lot of multiple pages, right? Because I'm that type of person. I like seeing everything in just like, boom, one thing versus multiple ones. So let's quickly talk about this. Infancy is birth to 1 year. When you're born, what tends to happen? Everybody here, when we were born, we had big heads. That's just the thing. Some of you did not outgrow that, unfortunately, but it's okay. Okay, so when we were little creatures, right, we had different types of reflexes. Page 177. Moral reflex is when you're sleeping, and then when something drops and the baby's like, okay, it gets started easily. That's the moral reflex. Okay, palmar reflex is every time you put something in their hand, they grab it. Okay, that's the palmar reflex. Rooting reflex is when you scrub something on their cheek, the infant follows that, right? That's called a rooting reflex. And the sucking reflex is every time you rub their lips, they grab onto it. Okay, so that's why moms, when they're trying to breastfeed their baby, and that's why in public places it looks weird when the mom's rubbing their nipple on the baby's cheek. It's basically a reflex because the baby's gonna follow that and then grab it. Okay, right. So what happens the psychosocial development? So on page 178, there's 4 concepts on there that I want you guys to know. So bonding. So bonding basically means that everything is met, right? That's a concept there. So when she's hungry, she's fed. When she poops, she needs to be changed. So that's what the bonding means. Trust versus mistrust basically means that there is an order. The infants, okay, follow a schedule, right? They sleep at this time, they eat at this time. When you interrupt that, that's an interruption of the trust versus mistrust, right? So, and then you have the scaffolding. Basically, they learn by building blocks, right? They learn mama, right? Then they say papa, and then everything else. That's called scaffolding. And then temperament is basically how they react to their environment. When they get scared, when they're kind of curious, right? So that's basically the psychosocial things for the infant. Okay. Then we have the toddler phase. Toddler phase is 12 to 36 months. This is the time where they're still developing. And this is also this time when they're starting to develop some knowledge and thinking, right? 12 to 36 months. Okay, so basically 1 to 3 years old. Then you have preschool age, 3 to 5 years. Physiologically, they're still growing. Psychosocially, this is where peer groups start, right? This is where the mean girls start to develop, okay, and the bullies start to develop, peer groups. This is the age group that I hate the most, 3 to 5. These are the evil little brats, okay? And I have a niece and nephew that are 3 to 5, so I can say that. And I hate them, but I love them. Then you have school age. Okay, school age is 6 to 12. With this specific age group, they're still growing, obviously, but this is also the time that they're spending less time with their parents, and they're starting to develop decision-making skills by themselves, right? This is also where the self-esteem kind of comes into play. This is why this specific age group, parents are more adamant about, hey, you should sign up for this one, taekwondo, join this, join that, to increase self-esteem, okay? Then you have the adolescents. Some of y'all still belong to this. 13 to 18 years old, okay? 13 to 18 years old. Physiologically, this is where the puberty almost kicks in, right? Enlargement of the bones, enlargements of breasts for female. Okay, males, the shoulders are are expanding. Okay, psychosocially, this is where you're finding the identity, right? This is the age group that becomes more interested in sex, right? And they're trying to find out who they are in life. Okay, why did y'all cringe when you heard the word sex? This proves that you're still youngins, right? Okay. This is also the age group where body image is a very concern, right? So these are the kids that are in the mall. It's like, oh my gosh, don't post that picture. I got like some pimple right there, whatever. That's this age group right here where body image is so concerning, right? And why do you think this is important as an EMT? Why do you need to learn this? Why do you need to learn that? Why do you need to know that if they're 14 years old, they're going to be this way? Why? Somebody just tell me out of nowhere. Like somebody, just explain. Or take a wild guess.
The situation properly.
Just very good, to handle the situation properly. Because if you know that this is a 14-year-old, you know that her main concern is body image, that she's not going to let you touch her face because there's a scratch right there, right? So you have to plan accordingly. How can I convince this young lady to let me treat that cut on her face? Okay, because she's like, I don't know, it's going to leave a scar in my face, right? So that's why. Then we have early adulthood, 19 to 40 years old. This is majority, some part of the class belongs to this age group, but this is where the highest stress occurs, because this is where you become an adult, right? Hashtag adulting happens now. You have to start paying bills, jobs, right? This is also where childbirth happens. This is where everybody stresses you need to get married, you need to expand the, our family line, right? And the most common cause for death for this age group is accidents, right? Accidents from car accidents, sports activities, etc. Then we have middle adulthood, 41 to 60 years old. This is when things start declining a little bit, right? You need glasses now. Everything's trying to slow down a little bit. Psychosocially, this is the age group with the emptiness syndrome. Okay, this is the age group with the emptiness syndrome. Okay, emptiness syndrome basically means like your mothers, okay, that you've abandoned already, right? For those of you that are part of a big family, when everybody's starting to leave the nest, what parents basically are like, well, what do we do now? Who do we take care of, right? So they experience that loneliness, and that's why they start calling you more often, because they're so used to taking care of you, okay? And then last but not the least, we have the late adulthood, 61 years old and older. This is basically where psychosocially they worry about certain areas and challenges such as living environment, because most of these people, where did their family puts them where? Where do we? Nursing homes, right? So they worry about that. Oh my gosh, they're probably going to put me in a nursing home. I have all these diseases. Their self-worth, they worry about that. They worry about what is my purpose in life? I'm already old and decrepit. So what else do I have to do? Financial burdens. They no longer have a job. Their retirement money is gone. So they have to worry about that. And then death and dying. They're close to dying. They see their friends dying at this specific age group. So those are their main concerns. Okay. That's basically a 5-minute breakdown of this specific chapter. Okay. And that is the end of the review session from chapters 1 through 8. Thank you so much for hanging in with me. But are there any questions, comments, concerns at all? Did this review session help out at all, guys, or was it just a waste of your time?
It was great.
Okay, good.
Helpful.
Like I said, HM1 will always do this a couple of days before the test specifically, because I want to make sure it's a fast-paced course. Okay, I know it is a fast-paced, and if I was a student, I would be overwhelmed as well, because even when I went through course school, I didn't feel like it was this fast-paced. But the Navy's trying to save more money, and the Air Force is saving more money. So I want to make sure that I'm doing due diligence to help you guys out. Because like I said, you guys will be my replacements in the future. And I want to make sure that you guys are knowledgeable and not just memorizing and pump dump information. Okay. Last but not the least, thank you so much. But please, just because I didn't cover it doesn't mean it's included. I will send you that email about the heart thing specifically for Alpha. If you don't get it by tonight, you will get it by tomorrow. And this is a recorded session, so it will also be posted I will send you the YouTube link once it is uploaded. And you guys can just click on the links or the sections that if you forgot something, then you can click on that one, okay? We'll have one tomorrow, but it's going to be a lot shorter. But other than that, you guys are free to log out, hang up. But if you do have any questions, I'll stand by here for about a couple more minutes, and then that's it. But other than that, you guys are free to go.
All right, good night, HM1.
Have a good night as well.
Deuces.
Shut your mouth. Bye. Hang up if you don't have questions. Bye. Bye.
I have a question. Go ahead.
Yes.
When
Yes.
will instructor from face to face?
I'm sorry?
For you to be your instructor in Alpha?
I will try my best to go to Alpha, but Mr. Andy and Cesar Montenegro are doing a pretty good job with that, so.
Aye.
I will try my best, though.
Thank you so much.